Hey there, history nerds! Tonight we're stepping into one of the wildest love stories the British Crown ever produced. Except it did not start with love at all. It started with a funeral. Imagine this. A young woman is engaged to marry a future king. Everything is set. The dress is probably being fitted somewhere in a palace, and then fate just rips the whole thing apart in a matter of days. So what does the royal family do? They hand her over to the younger brother like some kind of dynastic consolation prize. Romantic, right? Now here is the twist nobody expects. That awkward, forced, absolutely not a fairy tale arrangement somehow turned into the partnership that literally saved the British monarchy from collapsing in the 20th century. We are talking world wars, family scandals, an abdication crisis, and a king who could barely say "I love you" out loud, but wrote the most devoted letters you have ever heard of. George V and Mary of Teck. The couple history forgot, even though they built the foundation that Queen Elizabeth II stood on for 70 years. So before we dive in, do me a quick favour. Smash that like button if you're into royal deep dives and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. London? Lagos? Some random couch in Ohio at 2 a.m? I want to know. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab a tea because we're going full British tonight. This story has more plot twists than a Netflix series, and the best part, every single one of them actually happened. Let us get into it. January 1892. Sandringham House, Norfolk. Picture rolling green grounds, cold English winter air, and the kind of quiet that only old money can afford. Inside, Prince Albert Victor, Eddie to his family, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and the man who was supposed to become king one day, is lying in bed. He had been celebrating his 28th birthday just a few days earlier. The festivities had been cheerful enough, shooting parties, dinners, the usual aristocratic schedule of organised leisure. But somewhere between the pheasant hunts and the champagne toasts, something went wrong. Albert Victor developed a cough, then a fever, then pneumonia. And within 6 days of falling ill on January 14th, 1892, the heir presumptive to the British throne was gone. The cause was influenza, part of a pandemic that had been sweeping across Europe since 1889. Historians would later call it the Russian flu, because the first major outbreak was reported in St. Petersburg. It moved fast, it hit hard, and it did not care whether you lived in a cramped tenement or a palace with 400 rooms. Albert Victor, known to his family as Eddie, was one of its countless casualties, and just like that, the entire succession plan for the British monarchy was thrown into chaos. Now here is where things get personally devastating for one woman in particular. Mary of Teck, or Princess May, as people called her, had been engaged to Albert Victor for barely 6 weeks. The engagement had been announced in December 1891 to great public fanfare. Mary was 24, poised, well-educated, and considered an excellent match for the future king. She was not from one of the grand European royal houses, but she had something arguably more useful. She was sensible. The British royal family had watched her grow up, liked what they saw, and essentially handpicked her for the role of future queen consort. Queen Victoria herself had approved the match, which in that era was roughly equivalent to getting a 5-star review from the most powerful woman on earth. And then, in the span of less than a week, all of it evaporated. Mary went from being the fiancée of a future king to being nothing really, no title, no defined role, no clear future. She was stuck in a kind of royal limbo that Victorian etiquette had no playbook for. What exactly do you do when your fiancé passes away before the wedding? There was no protocol, no handbook, no helpful pamphlet titled, "So your royal engagement just fell apart." The social rules of the 1890s were meticulous about mourning. There were specific colours to wear, specific periods to observe, specific activities to avoid, but they had very little to say about the particular situation of a woman who had been formally engaged to a prince who no longer existed. Mary was expected to grieve, naturally. She was expected to wear black. She was expected to be dignified and restrained and appropriately sorrowful. But beyond that, nobody could quite tell her what she was supposed to do with the rest of her life. The British public, for their part, felt genuinely sorry for her. The newspapers wrote sympathetically about the young princess who had lost her future husband, and there was a widespread sense that Mary had been dealt an unfair hand by fate. She received letters of condolence from strangers across the country. She was treated in the press and in society with a kind of tender respect that acknowledged her loss without quite knowing how to categorize it. She was not a widow, she had never been married. She was not simply a former fiancée. The engagement had been a matter of state, not just personal choice. She existed in an entirely new category of royal misfortune, and everyone, including Mary herself, was improvising. The grief at Sandringham was genuine, but it was also, in the way of royal families, immediately practical. Because the moment Albert Victor stopped breathing, another question filled the room. What happens to the succession now? The answer was straightforward in constitutional terms. The next in line was Albert Victor's younger brother, Prince George. He was 26, a career naval officer, and until that cold January morning, he had been living the relatively carefree life of a second son. He had sailed the world, collected stamps with genuine passion, a hobby that sounds boring until you realise his collection would eventually be worth millions, and generally assumed that his older brother would handle the whole king business while he got to enjoy a quieter existence. That assumption ended the moment Eddie's heart stopped. George was now the heir presumptive, and the royal family, with the kind of efficiency that would make a corporate restructuring team jealous, quickly arrived at another conclusion. Mary of Teck was still the ideal candidate for queen consort. The fact that her intended husband had changed was, in dynastic terms, a minor logistical detail. She had been vetted. She had been approved. She had the temperament, the intelligence, and the bloodline. Why go through the trouble of finding someone new when the perfect candidate was already right there, wearing black? This was not, it should be said, an overnight decision announced the day after the funeral. The Victorians had a deep appreciation for the appearance of propriety, even when the underlying machinery was ruthlessly pragmatic. There was a mourning period. There were careful conversations. Queen Victoria, who had a talent for managing family affairs with the subtlety of a chess grandmaster, began dropping hints. Letters were exchanged between senior royals. The general consensus emerged slowly, but unmistakably. George and Mary should be brought together. The problem, naturally, was that neither George nor Mary had chosen each other. George, in particular, had his heart elsewhere. He had been involved with Julie Stoner, a young woman from a respectable Catholic family. The relationship was genuine. George cared for her deeply, but Julie was Catholic, and under the Act of Settlement of 1701, marrying a Catholic would have disqualified George from the line of succession. Not exactly a minor technicality when you have just become the future king. So the relationship was, with varying degrees of reluctance, set aside. George did not get to choose his wife any more than Mary got to choose her husband. They were both, in a sense, assigned to each other by a system that valued dynastic stability over personal happiness. For Mary, the situation carried an additional layer of emotional complexity that is hard to overstate. She was being asked to marry her dead fiancé's brother, the man she would stand beside at the altar, the man she would share a life with, would be a living, breathing reminder of the man she had lost, or at least the man she had been prepared to commit her life to. Whether Mary had been genuinely in love with Albert Victor is a question historians still debate. Their engagement had been short, and much of their interaction had been formal and supervised. But she had accepted him. She had prepared herself mentally for a life with him, and now she was being redirected to his younger sibling like a package returned to sender and forwarded to a new address. George, for his part, was dealing with his own complicated grief. He and Eddie had been close. They had grown up together, shared a childhood, and despite their very different personalities, Eddie was charming but unfocused. George was disciplined but shy. There was genuine brotherly affection between them. Now George was expected to step into his brother's shoes in every sense, take his place in the succession, take his role as future king, and take his fiancée. It was a lot to process for a man who, by all accounts, would have been perfectly content spending his life at sea, cataloguing rare postal stamps and avoiding public speeches. The courtship, such as it was, began cautiously. George and Mary were brought together at family gatherings, encouraged to spend time in each other's company, and gently nudged toward the conclusion that everyone around them had already reached. To their credit, they approached the situation with a kind of mature pragmatism that was rare even by royal standards. Neither pretended to be swept off their feet by a thunderbolt of passion. Neither played the reluctant victim. They simply got to know each other, carefully and deliberately, like two people assembling a piece of furniture together. Not romantic, perhaps, but effective. George proposed to Mary on May 3rd, 1893, in the garden of Sheen Lodge in Richmond. By several accounts, the proposal was awkward, understated, and very George. He was not a man of grand romantic gestures. He was not going to drop to one knee with a rehearsed speech and a string quartet hidden behind the hedgerow. He was a man who expressed deep feelings through carefully chosen words on paper, not through dramatic declarations. The proposal itself was reportedly brief, slightly nervous, and entirely devoid of the theatrical flourishes that a more confident suitor might have attempted. But Mary accepted, and one gets the sense that she accepted not because she was overwhelmed by romance, but because she recognised a decent man making an honest offer within a system that neither of them had the power to change. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of acceptance, even if it does not make for a particularly exciting scene in a film adaptation. The wedding took place on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. It was a grand affair by any standard. The guest list read like a directory of European monarchy, with kings, queens, princes and assorted nobles packed into the chapel alongside Britain's political establishment and the upper reaches of the aristocracy. Mary wore a gown of white silk, embroidered with silver and trimmed with orange blossoms, because apparently no Victorian bride could get married without referencing a citrus fruit somewhere in her outfit. The streets outside were lined with cheering crowds who had turned out in force despite the July heat, and the newspapers covered the event with the breathless enthusiasm that the British press has always reserved for royal weddings, as if the fate of civilization itself depended on the flower arrangements. The honeymoon was spent at York Cottage, a relatively modest house on the Sandringham estate that George adored, and Mary found, to put it diplomatically, somewhat cramped. York Cottage was not a cottage in any meaningful sense. It had multiple bedrooms and a full staff, but compared to the palaces Mary had grown up around, it was almost comically small. The rooms were cluttered with George's naval memorabilia, the furniture was heavy and dark, and the overall aesthetic could best be described as a Victorian gentleman's idea of cosy. Mary, whose Florentine education had given her an eye for art and design, reportedly looked around York Cottage with the kind of expression that suggested she was already mentally redecorating. She would, in fact, spend years trying to make the place more livable, though George's attachment to its nautical, cluttered charm meant that progress was slow. Despite the modest setting, the early months of the marriage were surprisingly warm. George was attentive in his own gruff way, and Mary was determined to make the partnership succeed. They established daily routines, breakfast together, separate activities during the day, evenings spent reading or talking, that would form the backbone of their domestic life for decades to come. George showed Mary his stamp collection. Mary showed George her knowledge of art and history. Neither was exactly thrilled by the other's passion, but both made the effort to be interested, which is arguably more important than genuine enthusiasm when you're building a lifelong partnership. Nobody mentioned, at least not publicly, that the bride had originally been intended for someone else. What nobody could have predicted on that July afternoon was just how well this arranged partnership would work. Not immediately. The early years had their share of awkwardness and adjustment. But over time, George and Mary would build something that most royal marriages of the era never achieved. A genuine, functioning partnership based on mutual respect, complementary strengths, and a shared sense of duty that bordered on the obsessive. It was not a fairy tale. It was something arguably more impressive. A working relationship between two people who had every reason to resent their circumstances, but chose instead to make the best of them. And that, frankly, is what makes this story worth telling. Because the arranged marriage that began with a funeral in January 1892 would eventually produce the blueprint for the modern British monarchy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how George and Mary became the team that held the crown together through wars, scandals, and an abdication crisis, we first need to understand who they were before fate threw them into the same room. George Frederick Ernest Albert was born on June 3, 1865 at Marlborough House in London. He was the second son of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Being the second son in a royal family is a peculiar position. You are close enough to power to feel its gravitational pull, but far enough away that nobody expects you to actually wield it. You are the backup plan, the understudy, the spare tyre in the trunk of the royal automobile. In family portraits you stand slightly behind the heir. At state dinners, you are seated one place further from the head of the table. Your education is slightly less rigorous, your schedule slightly less packed, your future slightly less defined. And in Victorian England, second sons of the heir to the throne were generally expected to pursue a career in the military, stay out of trouble, and avoid doing anything that might embarrass the family more than the eldest son already was. It was, in many ways, a life defined by what you were not, rather than what you were. George took the military option with enthusiasm. At the age of 12, he and his older brother Eddie were enrolled as naval cadets on HMS Britannia, the training ship moored at Dartmouth. This was not some gentle introduction to seafaring life with comfortable cabins and a well-stocked library. The Britannia was a floating school designed to turn privileged boys into competent sailors, and the methods were about as gentle as you would expect from the Victorian Royal Navy. The food was terrible, the discipline was strict, the sleeping quarters were cramped, and homesickness was treated not with sympathy but with more work. George, unsurprisingly, thrived. He had a natural affinity for order, routine, and clear chains of command, qualities that would serve him well in a very different kind of institution later in life. In 1879, when George was 14, he and Eddie were sent on a 3-year voyage aboard HMS Bacante, a corvette that would carry them roughly 40,000 miles across the world's oceans. They visited the Caribbean, South America, South Africa, Australia, Japan, China, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. For a teenager in the 1880s, this was the equivalent of the most extreme gap year imaginable, except instead of backpacking through hostels, you were scrubbing decks, learning navigation, and having your character forged by salt water and seasickness. The voyage was supervised by their tutor, John Neil Dalton, a clergyman who took his responsibilities with the kind of seriousness that only a Victorian educator could muster. Dalton kept detailed journals of the trip, recording everything from the prince's academic progress to the weather conditions at every port of call. The boys were expected to study, to participate in shipboard duties, and to behave with the discipline appropriate to their station, which meant that even in the most exotic locations on Earth, there was always homework to be done. Nothing quite kills the romance of sailing into a tropical harbour, like knowing you have a Latin translation due the next morning. George loved it. He developed a genuine passion for the sea, a deep respect for naval tradition, and a collection of tattoos that included a blue and red dragon on his arm, acquired during a stop in Japan. Not exactly what you picture when you think of a future British monarch, but then again, George never expected to be one. The tattoo became something of a family curiosity, proof that even the most buttoned-up king in British history had once been a teenager who made impulsive decisions in foreign ports. It was, in its own small way, the most relatable thing about him. The Bacante voyage also gave George something that would shape his worldview for the rest of his life, a first-hand look at the British Empire. He saw the colonies, the trading posts, the naval bases, the vast network of territories that made Britain the most powerful nation on Earth. He also saw the people who lived in those territories, though whether he fully understood the complexities of colonial rule at 14 is debatable. What he definitely absorbed was a sense of the empire's scale and importance, a conviction that the crown had a duty to its subjects across the globe, and an instinctive conservatism that would define his approach to governance decades later. Back in England, George continued his naval career with genuine dedication. He rose through the ranks not because of his royal blood, although that certainly did not hurt, but because he was actually good at his job. He commanded torpedo boats, served on battleships, and eventually reached the rank of vice-admiral. His fellow officers respected him. His sailors found him fair, if demanding. He was by all accounts a competent and committed naval officer who happened to be a prince, rather than a prince who was playing at being a naval officer. Meanwhile, his personal life was relatively uncomplicated, at least by royal standards. He had his relationship with Julie Stoner, which was serious enough that some historians believe he intended to marry her before the question of succession made that impossible. He had a small circle of close friends, mostly from the Navy. He collected stamps with a kind of meticulous obsession that suggested either genuine intellectual curiosity or a deep need for order in a chaotic world, probably both. And he lived in the comfortable knowledge that his older brother would handle the throne while he handled the quarterdeck. That comfortable knowledge, as we have already established, had an expiration date. Mary of Teck's childhood could not have been more different, though it shared one crucial element with George's, a sense of being perpetually on the margins of true royal privilege. Mary was born Victoria, Mary Augusta, Louise, Olga Pauline, Claudine Agnes on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace. That string of names alone tells you something about the expectations placed on her from birth. She was named after Queen Victoria, who was also her godmother, which was about as significant a social advantage as a baby could receive in Victorian England. Her father was Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, a member of the royal house of Württemberg in Germany. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of King George III. So on paper, Mary's pedigree was impeccable. She was royal on both sides, connected to the British crown through her mother, and linked to one of Germany's oldest noble families through her father. On paper, however, was about as far as the privilege extended. The problem was money, or rather, the spectacular absence of it. The Duke of Teck held a title but no territory and no significant income. He was what you might call a prince without a portfolio, all the prestige of royalty with none of the financial infrastructure to support it. Mary Adelaide, despite being a granddaughter of the king, received a parliamentary annuity that was generous by normal standards, but hilariously insufficient for someone who spent money the way most people breathe, constantly and without thinking about it. Mary Adelaide was famous for her extravagance, and not in the quiet, discreet way that the aristocracy preferred. She threw lavish parties for people she barely knew. She ordered expensive clothes from the finest dressmakers in London, and then ordered more before the first batch had been paid for. She donated generously to charity, which was admirable in principle but catastrophic in practice, when your own household budget was already running at a deficit. She maintained a staff of servants that was entirely appropriate for a princess of her rank, and entirely unsustainable on her actual income. The result was a family that looked royal, acted royal, and was technically royal, but could not actually afford to be royal. Creditors came calling with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. Bills piled up on desks and were moved to drawers and then to larger drawers. The Tecks lived, in essence, on a combination of royal prestige and creative accounting, neither of which was a sustainable long-term financial strategy. By the mid-1880s, the financial situation had become so dire that the Tecks were forced to do something almost unthinkable for a family of their standing. They left England to live abroad, where the cost of living was lower and their creditors were farther away. They settled in Florence, Italy, and it was here, in the sun-drenched palaces and galleries of Tuscany, that young Mary received the education that would set her apart from virtually every other royal woman of her generation. Florence in the 1880s was a paradise for anyone with cultural ambitions and a limited budget. The city was filled with art, architecture, music, and intellectual life, and much of it was accessible for free or at minimal cost. The great galleries charged modest admission, the churches were open to all, and the very streets themselves were an education in Renaissance aesthetics. Every corner revealed a facade, a fountain, or a fresco that would have made a London art dealer weep with envy. Mary, who was already showing signs of the sharp, inquisitive mind that would later make her such an effective queen consort, absorbed everything with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a world that matched her appetite for knowledge. She studied art history by walking through the Uffizi Gallery so often that the guards probably recognized her on sight. She learned to speak French, German, and Italian with fluency, a trilingual education that most British royals of the era would have considered excessive, if not slightly suspicious. She read widely, debated ideas with the expatriate intellectuals who populated Florence's social scene, attended concerts and lectures, and developed a passion for collecting beautiful objects that would stay with her for the rest of her life, sometimes to the alarm of the people whose beautiful objects she was admiring. The Florentine years also taught Mary something less tangible but equally important: how to live gracefully on limited resources. She had watched her mother spend money recklessly and had seen the consequences firsthand. In Florence, she learned that elegance did not require extravagance, that taste was more valuable than wealth, and that a well-curated collection of a few beautiful things was worth more than a warehouse full of expensive mediocrity. This Florentine education gave Mary something that formal royal training could not: a genuine intellectual depth and cultural sophistication that went beyond the decorative accomplishments expected of aristocratic women. Most princesses of the era were taught to play piano, make conversation at dinner, and look pleasant in a tiara. Mary could do all of those things, but she could also discuss Renaissance painting with authority, evaluate the provenance of an antique with a collector's eye, and hold her own in a conversation about European politics. She was, in short, the most overqualified person in any room that was not a university lecture hall, When the Teck family eventually returned to England, their finances stabilised, if not exactly flourishing, Mary re-entered British Royal Society as a young woman of 20-something, with excellent connections, impeccable manners, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are smarter than most of the people around you, but being too well-bred to mention it. Queen Victoria noticed her. The senior royals noticed her. And when the time came to find a suitable bride for Albert Victor, Mary's name rose to the top of a very short list. The qualities that made Mary attractive as a potential queen consort were precisely the qualities that Albert Victor lacked. He was charming but scattered, sociable but undisciplined, warm but unreliable. Mary was focused, organised, intellectually rigorous, and possessed of a work ethic that would have impressed a Prussian drill sergeant. The idea, from the royal family's perspective, was that Mary would be the steel spine inside the velvet glove of Albert Victor's reign, the competent partner who would keep things running while the king did the smiling and waving. When Albert Victor's passing redirected Mary toward George, the calculation changed, but the logic remained the same. George did not need a steel spine. He had one of his own, forged in the Royal Navy. What he needed was an intellectual partner, someone who could compensate for his limited formal education with her own cultural breadth, someone who understood the intricacies of European royal politics, and someone who could handle the social and ceremonial demands of royal life with grace and confidence. Mary was all of those things, and George, with his naval discipline, his sense of duty and his stubborn integrity, was exactly the kind of steady, reliable partner that Mary needed after a childhood spent watching her parents lurch from one financial crisis to the next. Neither of them knew any of this yet, of course. In 1893 they were simply two young people doing what they had been told to do, hoping it would work out. But the foundation was there, laid by childhoods that could not have been more different, but that produced, almost by accident, two people who fit together like complementary puzzle pieces. There was just one small problem with this promising partnership. George and Mary were both, in their own distinctive ways, absolutely terrible at expressing their feelings. This was not unusual for their era. Victorian England did not exactly encourage emotional vulnerability, particularly among the upper classes. Stiff upper lips were not just a cultural cliché, they were a survival strategy in a society where displaying too much emotion was considered a sign of weakness, poor breeding, or both. Children were taught to control their feelings from an early age, and the higher your social rank, the more control was expected. By the time you reached the level of the royal family, you were essentially required to have the emotional expressiveness of a particularly well-dressed statue. George took this cultural training and added his own personal layers of reserve on top of it. His years in the Royal Navy had reinforced every Victorian instinct toward emotional restraint. Naval officers did not discuss their feelings. They issued orders, they maintained discipline, they kept their personal lives neatly compartmentalized away from their professional duties. George internalized this completely. In person, he was warm enough in a gruff, blunt sort of way. He could be affectionate with people he trusted, and he had a surprisingly sharp sense of humour that emerged in private settings. But when it came to expressing deep emotion, tenderness, or romantic love, face to face, in actual spoken words, he simply could not do it. The words were there inside him, but they refused to travel from his heart to his mouth. They did, however, travel quite willingly from his heart to his pen. George was, by all evidence, a devoted and often eloquent letter writer. When he was separated from Mary, which happened frequently, given the demands of royal duties, naval obligations, and the general Victorian habit of maintaining multiple residences, he wrote to her with a warmth and openness that would have startled anyone who only knew him in person. His letters were affectionate, sometimes tender, occasionally vulnerable. He told her he missed her. He told her she was essential to his happiness. He told her things that, in a modern context, would seem perfectly ordinary expressions of love between married people, but that in their context represented a kind of emotional courage that George could only summon when he had a pen in his hand, and his wife was safely far enough away that she could not actually see his face while he said these things. Mary, for her part, found this arrangement both touching and maddening. She was not, by nature, an emotionally demonstrative person either. Her own upbringing had taught her to maintain composure under all circumstances, and she had a natural reserve that matched George's in many respects. But she craved directness. She wanted George to say these things to her face. She wanted the spoken word, the eye contact, the simple human connection of hearing someone you love tell you they love you while standing in the same room. In one letter, she essentially told George this outright, that she wished he could just say to her in person what he wrote so beautifully on paper. George, characteristically, responded to this request by writing her another letter about how difficult he found it to express his feelings in person. You really cannot make this up. The man was asked to stop communicating exclusively through letters, and his answer was to communicate that difficulty through a letter. If there were an award for missing the point with maximum sincerity, George would have won it every year of his marriage. This dynamic, George pouring his heart out on paper while Mary waited patiently for him to say any of it out loud, defined their relationship for over 4 decades. It was frustrating, it was incomplete, and it was, by any modern standard of communication, deeply dysfunctional. But here is the thing that makes it fascinating rather than merely sad. It worked. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it worked in a way that many supposedly healthier, more openly emotional royal marriages did not. Consider the competition. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were littered with royal marriages that burned brightly and then collapsed into scandal, separation, or mutual contempt. George's own parents, Edward VII and Alexandra, had a marriage that was publicly warm but privately complicated by Edward's relentless infidelity. His grandmother Victoria had been passionately in love with Prince Albert, but Albert's early passing had sent her into a grief so consuming that it effectively paralysed the monarchy for decades. Across Europe, royal marriages were imploding with impressive regularity. Kaiser Wilhelm II's relationship with his wife Augusta Victoria was strained by his erratic personality. Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra of Russia were genuinely in love, but their marriage would end in a tragedy so complete that it defies comfortable description. Against this backdrop of passion, betrayal, and catastrophe, George and Mary's quiet, awkward, letter-dependent partnership looks remarkably solid. They never had a major public scandal. There were no credible rumours of infidelity on either side. They disagreed on things. They were human beings, not automatons. But they disagreed privately, resolved their differences quietly, and presented a united front to the world with a consistency that bordered on mechanical. Their marriage was not exciting. It was not the stuff of romance novels or sweeping film adaptations, but it was durable, functional, and ultimately effective in a way that mattered enormously for the institution they represented. Part of the reason it worked was that George and Mary had complementary roles that gave them each a defined space within the partnership. George handled the constitutional duties, the political relationships, the military connections. Mary handled the cultural, social, and ceremonial dimensions. He was the steady hand on the tiller. She was the one who made sure the ship looked presentable while it was being steered. They did not compete with each other. They did not undermine each other. They operated as a team, each trusting the other to handle their respective domain with competence. This division of labour was not always equal. Mary's contributions were frequently overlooked or minimised by contemporary observers who saw the Queen Consort's role as decorative rather than substantive. But within the privacy of their own relationship, George recognised Mary's value clearly. He relied on her judgment, sought her advice, and trusted her instincts on matters of protocol, public relations, and family management. He just could not bring himself to tell her any of this while looking her in the eye. There was also a deeper emotional logic at work in their marriage that is easy to miss if you focus too much on its surface awkwardness. George and Mary had both experienced profound losses and disruptions before they were even married. George had lost his brother, his freedom of choice, and his naval career, all in quick succession. Mary had lost her fiancé, her planned future, and whatever remaining illusions she might have had about romantic love being a factor in royal marriages. They came to their partnership already stripped of sentimentality, already aware that life could change catastrophically without warning, already conditioned to value stability and duty over passion and spontaneity. This shared experience of loss and adaptation created a bond that was deeper than it appeared on the surface. They understood each other not because they talked about their feelings, they manifestly did not, but because they recognized in each other the same capacity for stoic endurance, the same willingness to put institutional duty above personal desire, the same quiet determination to make the best of circumstances they had not chosen. It was a marriage built not on the foundation of what they said to each other, but on the foundation of what they both understood without saying. The letters, in this context, were not a failure of communication but an alternative form of it, a safety valve that allowed George to express things he genuinely felt but could not bring himself to verbalise. And Mary, despite her frustration, eventually came to accept the letters for what they were, the truest expression of her husband's feelings, delivered in the only format he could manage. She kept them, she treasured them. And decades later, when historians would study the marriage of George V and Queen Mary, those letters would provide the evidence that this apparently cold, formal, emotionally stunted partnership was, in its own peculiar way, a genuine love story. Not a conventional one, certainly. Not one that would sell many romance novels or generate much enthusiasm on social media. But a real one. A love story told in ink and paper, between two people who cared deeply for each other and simply could not figure out how to say so in the same room at the same time. There is something both very human and very specifically British about that. And it was this quiet, imperfect, stubbornly functional partnership that would be tested in ways that neither George nor Mary could have imagined on their wedding day in 1893, because the world they married into, the comfortable, stable, seemingly permanent world of Victorian and Edwardian England, was about to start coming apart at the seams. And when it did, the king and queen who could not say I love you to each other's faces would need every ounce of that unspoken bond to hold their family, their crown, and their country together. But that is a story for the next chapter. The partnership that George and Mary built through ink and unspoken understanding faced its most complicated test, not on any public stage, but in the nursery. Because whatever their strengths as a royal couple, and those strengths were considerable, their record as parents is, to put it gently, a mixed bag. Actually, to put it less gently, it is the kind of parenting record that would have a modern child psychologist reaching for a second notebook and a stronger cup of coffee. Their first child, Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, yes, that is one child, not committee, was born on June 23, 1894, barely a year after the wedding. He would be known to the family as David, because apparently 7 names were not enough and they needed an 8th option for casual use. The naming convention alone tells you something about royal expectations. Every name was a tribute to a predecessor, a relative, or a patron saint, and the poor child was expected to carry all of them around like a monogrammed suitcase. David's arrival was followed in rapid succession by Albert in 1895, Mary in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and finally John in 1905. 6 children in 11 years. George and Mary had, with characteristic efficiency, produced a full complement of heirs and spares, enough to staff a small dynasty, and still have reserves on the bench. The problem was not the production of children. The problem was what happened after they arrived. George approached fatherhood the way he approached most things in life, through the lens of naval discipline. He had spent his formative years on warships where order was maintained through strict hierarchy, clear rules, and immediate consequences for disobedience. He had thrived in that environment and genuinely believed it produced the best version of a person. So when it came to raising his own children, he applied the same principles with absolute sincerity and absolutely no awareness that a household full of small children might function differently from a torpedo boat. Mealtimes were conducted with military precision. The children were expected to appear on time, sit straight, eat what was placed in front of them, and speak only when addressed. Dessert was not a right but a privilege, and it could be revoked for infractions that range from poor table manners to insufficient enthusiasm during morning prayers. George inspected their appearance the way a commanding officer inspects a parade line. Shoes polished, hair combed, posture correct, expression respectful. A crooked tie or a scuffed shoe was not merely a minor lapse in grooming. It was, in George's worldview, evidence of a dangerous lack of discipline that, if left unchecked, might eventually lead to the collapse of the entire social order. The man did not do proportional response when it came to parenting. Any deviation from these standards was met with sharp correction. George had a booming voice that he had developed on the quarterdeck, where it needed to carry across a ship in a gale, and he deployed it in the nursery with the same volume and authority. The effect on small children, unsurprisingly, was somewhat different than the effect on seasoned sailors. Grown men might snap to attention at the sound of a captain's bark. 5-year-olds tended to burst into tears. This was not, it should be said, cruelty in the way George understood it. He genuinely believed he was preparing his children for the demands of royal life, The world they would inhabit, the public scrutiny, the ceremonial demands, the relentless expectations, required discipline, composure, and the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. George knew this from personal experience. His own upbringing had been strict, his naval training had been stricter, and he saw no reason why his children should be spared the process that had, in his view, made him the steady and dependable person he was. The fact that this process was also making his children anxious, fearful, and emotionally withdrawn was something he either did not notice or did not know how to address. Mary's role in all of this is harder to categorize. She was not a cold person by nature. Her letters and diaries reveal a woman who cared about her children and worried about their well-being. But she was also a product of an era that drew very firm boundaries around the role of a royal mother. In the late Victorian and Edwardian world, upper-class children were raised primarily by nannies, governesses, and tutors. Parents, particularly royal parents, were more like executive overseers than hands-on caregivers. They set the general direction of a child's upbringing but delegated the daily business of feeding, clothing, comforting, and disciplining to the staff. This was not considered neglectful. It was considered normal. It was simply how things were done in families of that rank, and questioning the system was about as common as questioning the weather. The problem with this system, in the case of George and Mary's household, was the quality of the staff. This was not an unusual problem. The Victorian and Edwardian nursery was, for all its outward respectability, something of a gamble. Nannies were hired based on references, appearance, and the recommendation of other aristocratic families, but there was no formal training, no standardized qualifications, and certainly no background checks in any modern sense. A nanny who presented well in an interview and came with a letter from a duchess could be competent, caring, and wonderful with children. She could also be controlling, neglectful, or worse. The parents, who saw their children for perhaps an hour a day, often the carefully staged hour before bedtime, when the children were washed, dressed in their best clothes, and presented like small exhibits in a domestic museum, had limited ability to assess what was actually happening during the other 23 hours. The first nanny hired for the eldest children was, by all credible accounts, a disaster. She appears to have taken a strong personal attachment to young David, the future Edward VIII, and an equally strong dislike to his younger brother Albert. Her methods of expressing this preference were, by modern standards, appalling. She would pinch Albert before bringing him to see his parents, ensuring that he was crying and irritable when he arrived, which reinforced the impression that he was a difficult child. David, meanwhile, received excessive attention that crossed the line from nurturing into possessiveness. She reportedly resisted allowing the parents to spend time with the children, inserting herself as a barrier between the family and the nursery. This went on for roughly 3 years before it was finally discovered, and the nanny was dismissed. 3 years during which the foundational experiences of 2 future kings were being shaped by someone whose approach to childcare would today result in immediate termination and probably legal consequences. The fact that it took so long for George and Mary to realise what was happening says something important about the structure of their household. They were not negligent parents in the sense of not caring. They were negligent in the sense of having outsourced the most intimate aspects of parenting to people they did not adequately supervise. George was busy with an expanding portfolio of royal duties. Mary was managing the household, the social calendar, and her own ceremonial obligations. Neither spent enough time in the nursery to notice that the person they had entrusted with their children's daily welfare was causing harm. This was a systemic failure as much as a personal one, a consequence of the rigid class structures that kept parents and children in separate spheres even when they lived under the same roof. A replacement nanny was found, and by most accounts she was a considerable improvement, competent, stable, and genuinely caring. Her name was Charlotte Bill, the same Lala who would later care for Prince John, and under her supervision the nursery became a calmer and more predictable place. But the damage from the early years had already been done, particularly to Albert, who developed a severe stammer that would plague him for the rest of his life. Whether the stammer was directly caused by the nanny's treatment is impossible to prove medically, but the timing is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Albert, the future George VI, the king who would lead Britain through the Second World War, grew up anxious, insecure, and terrified of public speaking, which is approximately the worst combination of traits you can have if your job will eventually require you to address the entire nation via radio. The children's relationship with their father followed a pattern that was consistent across all 6 of them, though its effects varied. George loved his children. This is clear from his letters, his diaries, and the testimony of those who observed him in private. He was capable of warmth, of humour, of genuine affection. But he expressed these feelings in the same maddening way he expressed his feelings for Mary, awkwardly, intermittently, and almost never when it mattered most. In person, he was more likely to criticise than to praise, more likely to correct than to encourage, more likely to bark an order than to offer a hug. The children learned early that their father's approval was something to be earned through perfect behaviour, not something that was freely given. David, as the eldest and the heir, bore the heaviest weight of these expectations. George was determined that his firstborn would be prepared for the throne, and his method of preparation was relentless scrutiny. Every mistake was noted. Every shortcoming was highlighted. Every deviation from the standard was met with a lecture about duty, responsibility, and the demands of the crown. David's education was rigorous by any measure. Tutors, governesses, and eventually naval training, following the same path George himself had taken. But where George had embraced the discipline of naval life, David chafed under it. He was more sociable than his father, more curious about the world beyond protocol, and increasingly resentful of the rigid expectations being piled onto him from birth. George interpreted this resistance as laziness or willfulness. It was, more accurately, the entirely predictable response of a young man who had been given no room to develop his own identity outside the shadow of the crown. The effect, predictably, was the opposite of what George intended. Instead of producing a disciplined and dutiful heir, he produced a young man who associated the monarchy with oppression and spent much of his adult life running as far from responsibility as his circumstances would allow. The seeds of the abdication crisis of 1936 were planted, at least in part, in the nursery at York Cottage. George wanted David to be a better version of himself. David wanted to be anything but a version of his father. Neither of them ever found a way to bridge that gap. Albert, the second son, responded to his father's strictness with a different strategy. Desperate attempts to please, combined with crippling anxiety when he inevitably fell short. His stammer made verbal communication agonizing, particularly in front of his father, whose impatience with hesitation was legendary. George would snap at Albert to get on with it, to speak up, to stop mumbling, instructions that were about as helpful for a stammer as telling someone with a broken leg to walk faster. Albert grew up believing he was inadequate, an impression that would take decades and one very patient speech therapist to begin correcting. The younger children, Mary, Henry, George and John, had a somewhat easier time, partly because parental attention was spread thinner by the time they arrived, and partly because the expectations placed on them were less intense. They were not heirs. They were not going to be king. They could, within the rigid framework of royal life, be slightly more themselves. But even they were shaped by the household's emotional climate, the distant father, the formal mother, the atmosphere of duty and discipline that permeated every room like a particularly well-organised draft. There is one episode, however, that complicates the portrait of George and Mary as emotionally detached parents, and it deserves attention precisely because it contradicts the prevailing narrative. In 1901, George and Mary embarked on an imperial tour that took them to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and Canada. The trip lasted 8 months, 8 months away from their children, the oldest of whom was 7 and the youngest barely a toddler. This was not a vacation. It was a duty, a grand tour of the Empire's major dominions, demanded by the political needs of the newly crowned Edward VII, who wanted his heir to strengthen colonial ties through personal appearances. George and Mary did not choose to leave their children for the better part of a year. They were told to go, and they went, because that was what royal duty required. But the separation cost them. George's letters home during the tour reveal a father who genuinely missed his children and worried about them constantly. He asked after their health, their progress, their moods. He wanted to know what they were eating, what they were learning, what games they were playing. Mary, who was generally more restrained in her correspondence, also wrote with evident longing. She sent gifts from every port of call. She counted the days until the return voyage. When they finally arrived home in November 1901, the reunion was, by all accounts, emotional, at least by the standards of a family that considered visible emotion roughly equivalent to a minor diplomatic incident. This matters because it shows that the distance between George, Mary and their children was not entirely a matter of choice or temperament. It was also a product of the institution they served, an institution that demanded their time, their presence, and their energy in ways that left precious little of any of those things for the nursery. They were, in a real sense, competing with the Empire for their children's attention, and the Empire usually won. Not because they wanted it to, but because the system they inhabited was designed that way. And then there was John. Prince John, the youngest, was born in 1905, and for the first few years of his life he appeared to be developing like any other royal child. But around the age of 4, he began experiencing seizures. The diagnosis was epilepsy, a condition that in the early 20th century was profoundly misunderstood. Modern medicine recognizes epilepsy as a neurological condition that can be managed with medication and that carries absolutely no implications about a person's intelligence, character, or worth. In 1909, none of that understanding existed. Epilepsy was stigmatized, feared, and associated in the public mind with everything from mental deficiency to divine punishment. It was, in the language of the era, an affliction, something to be hidden, managed quietly, and never discussed in polite company, let alone in the pages of a newspaper. The royal family's response to John's condition was shaped entirely by these attitudes. As his seizures became more frequent and more severe, the decision was made to move him away from the main household. He was eventually settled at Wood Farm, a smaller property on the Sandringham estate, under the care of a devoted governess named Charlotte Bill, known to the family as Lala. John lived there with Lala and a small staff, visited occasionally by his parents and siblings, but increasingly separated from the daily life of the family. He did not appear at public events. He was not photographed for official portraits after a certain age. He was, in effect, removed from the public narrative of the royal family, as if he had never existed. Was this cruel? The question hangs over the story of Prince John like a cloud that refuses to clear, and the answer depends entirely on what era's standards you apply. By modern standards, obviously yes. Children with epilepsy today live fully integrated lives, and the idea of hiding a child on a country estate feels deeply wrong. But the early 20th century was not the 21st century, and judging George and Mary purely by modern standards risks missing the context that shaped their decision. They were operating with the medical knowledge available to them, which was limited and largely wrong. Their doctors told them that quiet, rural surroundings would be better for John's health. The social expectations of the time told them that a child with epilepsy could not be part of public royal life without inviting scrutiny, gossip, and potentially damaging speculation about the health of the royal bloodline. And their own emotional vocabulary, already limited as we have seen, gave them no tools for processing the grief and helplessness they almost certainly felt about their youngest son's condition. There is evidence that both George and Mary cared about John and were pained by the situation. George visited Wood Farm. Mary wrote about John in her diary with evident affection. They did not forget him or abandon him emotionally, even if they removed him physically. And Lala Bill, by all accounts, gave John a life that was as full and happy as circumstances allowed. He had a garden. He had animals, chickens, dogs, and other creatures that provided the kind of uncomplicated companionship that the royal family's rigid social structures could not. He had a small circle of companions, including local children from the estate who were brought in to play with him. He was, within the very narrow world available to him, apparently content. Photographs from this period show a boy who smiles easily, who seems comfortable outdoors, and who displays none of the anxiety or formality that characterized his older siblings. Whether this contentment was genuine or simply the limited happiness of someone who had never known anything different is a question that cannot be answered, but the evidence suggests that John's life at Wood Farm, while isolated, was not unhappy. John passed away on January 18, 1919, at the age of 13, following a severe seizure. Mary wrote in her diary that the news was a great shock, though she added, with the complicated honesty that sometimes emerges in private writing, that his passing was perhaps a release from a life that had become increasingly difficult. George was reportedly devastated. The family grieved privately. The public was informed through a brief official announcement, and the story of Prince John faded into the margins of royal history, where it remained largely forgotten for decades. The question of whether George and Mary were good parents does not have a clean answer. They were not abusive in any deliberate sense. They did not set out to harm their children, They provided materially. Their children wanted for nothing in terms of food, shelter, education, or physical security. They cared in their own constrained and emotionally muffled way. But they were also products of a system that prioritized duty over affection, appearance over authenticity, and institutional stability over individual well-being. Their children paid the price for that system in different ways. David through rebellion, Albert through anxiety, John through isolation, and the others through varying degrees of emotional distance that would echo through their adult lives. If there is a lesson in the parenting of George V and Queen Mary, it is probably this. Loving your children and being good at raising them are not the same thing. You can do one without managing the other, and the gap between the two can shape entire generations. The House of Windsor would spend the rest of the 20th century dealing with the consequences of that gap, in abdications, in strained relationships, in the ongoing struggle to balance the demands of the crown with the needs of the people wearing it. But in 1911, all of that was still in the future. George and Mary's children were young, the family's problems were still private, and the British Empire was about to stage the most spectacular display of imperial power the world had ever seen. On December 12, 1911, the city of Delhi witnessed something that had never happened before and would never happen again. A reigning British monarch stood on Indian soil and presented himself, in person, as Emperor of India. George V and Queen Mary had travelled halfway around the world to attend the Delhi Durbar, a ceremony of allegiance and celebration that was intended to demonstrate the unbreakable bond between the British Crown and its most prized colonial possession. It was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious pieces of political theatre in history. It was also, though nobody standing in that enormous crowd could have known it at the time, the high water mark of an empire that was already beginning to recede. The word Durbar comes from the Persian, meaning a court or audience. The tradition of holding grand ceremonial gatherings in India predated British rule by centuries. The Mughal emperors had staged their own elaborate durbars to receive tribute from vassals and display their power to the world. The British, with their characteristic talent for appropriating other cultures' traditions and repackaging them with a Union Jack on top, adopted the format and turned it into an instrument of imperial propaganda. There had been durbars before, in 1877, when Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, and in 1903, when Edward VII's coronation was celebrated in absentia. But neither of those earlier events had featured the actual physical presence of the monarch. Victoria never visited India. Edward VII never visited India. The idea that a British king would actually show up in person was considered impractical, expensive, and possibly beneath the dignity of the crown. George disagreed. He wanted to go. And what George wanted in matters of imperial symbolism, George generally got. The context matters here. George and Mary had been crowned king and queen just 5 months earlier, on June 22, 1911, at Westminster Abbey. The coronation had been a magnificent affair in itself, all the traditional pageantry of a British crowning, complete with ancient rituals, heavy robes, and a crown that George wore with the solemn determination of a man who understood exactly what it represented. But in George's mind, the coronation in London was only half the story. He was not merely king of the United Kingdom, he was Emperor of India, ruler of the largest colonial territory on earth, and he believed that title meant something, that it carried obligations that could not be fulfilled from a distance. If the people of India were his subjects, then he owed them the respect of appearing before them in person. It was, in George's characteristically straightforward worldview, simply the right thing to do. The preparations were staggering. A temporary city, an entire city, was constructed on the plains north of Delhi, near the site that would become known as Coronation Park. Tens of thousands of workers built roads, erected tents, installed plumbing, and laid out gardens in what was essentially the most expensive campsite in human history. The logistics alone would have given a modern event planner a nervous breakdown. Water had to be piped in from miles away. Electricity, still a relative novelty in much of India, had to be generated on site. Sanitation for hundreds of thousands of people had to be arranged in an era when the flush toilet was considered cutting-edge technology in most of the world. The main amphitheatre alone could seat over 100,000 people. There were separate camps for each of the Indian princes and maharajas who were expected to attend. And since these were men who competed with each other in displays of wealth, the way modern billionaires compete with yacht sizes, the camps were elaborate affairs featuring silk tents, imported furniture, and enough servants to staff a medium-sized hotel. One Maharaja reportedly brought his own solid silver dining service. Another arrived with a retinue that included personal musicians, a small zoo, and a chef who specialized exclusively in desserts. The Durbar had not yet begun, and it was already the most extravagant gathering of the decade. George and Mary arrived in India in early December, after a sea voyage that had taken them through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the Indian Ocean. The journey itself was something of an event. At every port along the way, local officials and dignitaries turned out to greet them, and the royal couple performed the kind of abbreviated ceremonial duties that are the travelling monarch's equivalent of a layover. By the time they reached Bombay, they had already shaken more hands, smiled at more crowds, and consumed more formal dinners than most people manage in a lifetime. The heat was immediate, the colours were overwhelming, and the sheer volume of humanity that greeted them at every stop was unlike anything they had experienced even at the largest events in England. India was not simply a different country, it was a different scale of existence. From Bombay, they travelled by rail to Delhi, and the train journey itself offered a kind of rolling tutorial in the complexity of the subcontinent. Outside the windows, the landscape shifted from coastal plains to agricultural heartland, from bustling towns to villages where life had changed very little in centuries. George, who had seen the empire from the deck of a warship as a teenager, was now seeing it from ground level for the first time as its sovereign, and the experience was clearly affecting. He noted in his diary the vastness of the land, the variety of its people, and the almost incomprehensible challenge of governing a territory this diverse from an island 4,000 miles away. They were accompanied by a retinue of advisors, servants, and security personnel, along with enough luggage to furnish several houses, which, given that they were going to be living in tents for several weeks, was probably not an overreaction. Mary, whose eye for visual detail was as sharp as ever, had overseen the design of her wardrobe for the event with the precision of a field marshal planning a campaign. Every gown, every jewel, every accessory had been selected to project exactly the right combination of imperial majesty and approachable warmth. This was not vanity, it was strategy. In an era before television and social media, royal appearances were experienced live or through newspaper descriptions, and every visual element mattered. Mary understood this instinctively. The clothes were not for her pleasure, but for the empire's consumption. The Durbar ceremony itself was a spectacle that defies easy description. George and Mary entered the arena seated on a raised platform beneath a golden canopy, wearing specially created robes and crowns. George wore the imperial crown of India, a piece created specifically for this event, because the actual British crown jewels were not permitted to leave the country, a rule that presumably existed to prevent exactly the kind of ambitious overseas adventure that George was currently undertaking. The crown was studded with over 6,000 diamonds, sapphires and emeralds, and weighed enough to give anyone wearing it for more than an hour a serious appreciation for the concept of a chiropractor. 500,000 people gathered to witness the ceremony. Indian princes in jewelled turbans paid homage. Military regiments in dress uniform paraded past. Elephants, actual elephants, decorated with gold and silk, added a visual element that Buckingham Palace's standard ceremonial toolkit simply could not match. The sound of trumpets, drums, and massed bands filled the air. The heat was extraordinary. December in Delhi is cooler than the summer months, but cooler is a relative term when you're wearing several layers of ceremonial robes, a crown weighing several pounds, and sitting on a throne under a canopy that traps warmth like a particularly ornate greenhouse. George endured it with characteristic stoicism. Mary endured it with characteristic poise. Both of them were probably more uncomfortable than any photograph from the event suggests, but the photographs suggest nothing but serene imperial majesty, which was, of course, the entire point. George read a proclamation announcing, among other things, the transfer of India's capital from Calcutta to Delhi, a decision that had been kept secret until that moment, and that sent shockwaves through the colonial administration. The announcement was a masterstroke of political theatre. By saving it for the Durbar, George ensured that the news would be forever associated with his personal presence in India, with this moment of peak imperial spectacle. The new capital would eventually be built as New Delhi, a planned city designed by Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, intended to be a permanent monument to British rule in India. It would, of course, become instead the capital of an independent nation, which is the kind of historical irony that writes itself. The ceremony also included the announcement of several royal boons, gifts to India that included the reversal of the unpopular partition of Bengal, a measure that had been causing significant political unrest. George understood, or at least his advisers understood, that a Durbar without tangible benefits for the Indian population would look like pure spectacle. Impressive, but hollow. The Bengal announcement was designed to demonstrate that the King-Emperor was not merely a ceremonial figure in a heavy crown, but an active force for governance, capable of listening to grievances and responding with action. Whether the Indian population found this convincing is another matter entirely, but the gesture was at least noted. The following day, George and Mary appeared on the balcony of the Red Fort, the magnificent sandstone fortress that had served as the seat of Mughal power for centuries. The Red Fort was not just any building. It had been commissioned by Shah Jahan in 1639, the same emperor who built the Taj Mahal, and it had served as the political heart of one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated empires in human history. Its walls were inlaid with precious stones. Its halls had once hosted audiences where diamonds the size of eggs changed hands as diplomatic gifts. For George and Mary to stand on its balcony, looking out over the same view that Mughal emperors had surveyed, was a deliberate act of symbolic appropriation, a visual argument that British authority had succeeded and supplanted Mughal grandeur. Below them, a vast crowd of Delhi residents looked up at the British king and queen standing in the place where emperors had once held court. The symbolism was layered and deliberate. This was not just a ceremony, it was a statement of continuity, a claim that British rule was the natural successor to Mughal authority, that the crown had inherited the legitimacy of the subcontinent's previous rulers. Whether the crowd below shared this interpretation is naturally not something the official records dwell on. Mary, characteristically, was fascinated by everything she saw. She visited monuments, studied Mughal architecture, examined Indian craftsmanship with her collector's eye, and wrote detailed descriptions of the art and artifacts she encountered. Her interest was genuine, though it was filtered through the assumptions of her era. She appreciated Indian culture as something beautiful and exotic to be observed and catalogued, not as the living expression of a civilization that might have its own opinions about being ruled from London. George was more focused on the political dimensions. He met with Indian leaders, received petitions, and listened to briefings about the state of the subcontinent with the conscientiousness that characterized everything he did. He was, by all accounts, genuinely moved by the scale and diversity of India and by the warmth of the reception he received. What he perhaps did not fully appreciate, what almost no British official fully appreciated in 1911, was that the warmth was not universal, and that the spectacle of the Durbar, for all its grandeur, was masking forces that would eventually tear the entire imperial project apart. Because even as 500,000 people watched George and Mary beneath their golden canopy, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi was developing ideas about non-violent resistance that would eventually make the British presence in India untenable. Gandhi had returned to India from South Africa just a few years earlier, where he had spent 2 decades organising the Indian community against discriminatory laws. He had developed, through trial and error, a philosophy of resistance that rejected armed confrontation in favour of moral pressure, a strategy that the British Empire, with all its military might, would ultimately prove unable to counter. In 1911, Gandhi was not yet a household name. He was not yet the Mahatma. He was a middle-aged lawyer with unusual ideas and a growing reputation, but the intellectual and moral framework for the independence movement was already taking shape in his writings, his speeches, and his experiments with communal living. The Durbar was a celebration of empire at its zenith. It was also, though nobody would have phrased it this way at the time, a display of something that was already beginning to expire. The seeds of Indian independence were not planted by Gandhi alone, of course. The Indian National Congress had been founded in 1885, and by 1911 it had already been agitating for greater self-governance for over a quarter century. Educated Indians across the subcontinent were reading political philosophy, debating constitutional reform, and building the organisational infrastructure that would eventually support a mass independence movement. The Durbar, for all its splendour, could not obscure the fundamental contradiction at its heart, that a ceremony celebrating the bond between ruler and ruled was being held in a country where the ruled had no meaningful say in their own governance. George and Mary sat on their thrones in Coronation Park, surrounded by 500,000 people, and not one of those people had been asked whether they wanted to be there. The irony of the Delhi Durbar is that it succeeded perfectly as a piece of theatre, while failing completely as a piece of prophecy. Everything it was designed to demonstrate, the permanence of British rule, the loyalty of Indian subjects, the unshakable bond between Crown and colony, would be proven false within a few decades. India would gain its independence in 1947, just 36 years after George stood in Coronation Park and received the allegiance of the subcontinent. The princes who bowed before him would see their own power dissolved. The empire that the Durbar celebrated would contract, fragment, and eventually disappear almost entirely. But in December 1911, none of that was visible. What was visible was the most impressive display of imperial power that the British Crown had ever staged. A £250,000 spectacle in the Indian sun, complete with elephants, diamonds, and a king who genuinely believed that the empire he ruled would endure indefinitely. George and Mary sailed back to England in January 1912, having accomplished everything they set out to do. The Durbar had been a triumph of logistics, symbolism, and sheer visual spectacle. The photographs and descriptions that reached British newspapers painted a picture of an empire at the absolute peak of its confidence and power. What nobody could see, standing in that golden light in Delhi, was the shadow that was already stretching across Europe. Within 3 years, the world that made the Durbar possible, the world of empires, of unchallenged colonial authority, of confident assumption that Western civilization had reached its permanent apex, would be shattered by a conflict so vast and so devastating that nothing would ever quite look the same again. And George and Mary, the king and queen who had stood in the place of Mughal emperors and received the homage of 500,000 people, would find themselves at the centre of a storm that would test everything they had built together. The War of Cousins was coming, and it would change everything. The golden light of Delhi had barely faded from memory when the world began to crack. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was shot in Sarajevo by a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. The assassination set off a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations that, within 6 weeks, dragged most of Europe into the largest armed conflict the world had ever seen. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia partially accepted but partially refused. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany mobilized in support of Austria-Hungary. France mobilized because it was allied with Russia. And Britain, which had been trying to mediate the crisis from the sidelines, was pulled in when Germany invaded Belgium, a country whose neutrality Britain was treaty-bound to protect. The whole thing unfolded with the terrible logic of a row of dominoes falling, each one knocking over the next in a sequence that seemed unstoppable once the first piece had been pushed. By August 4th, 1914, Britain was at war with Germany. George signed the declaration of war himself, and reportedly told his diary afterward that it was a terrible catastrophe, but one that could not have been avoided. Whether that assessment was entirely accurate is a question historians still debate, but George's personal anguish was genuine, and for the king, this was not merely a political crisis or a military emergency. It was, in a very personal and deeply uncomfortable sense, a family argument that had gotten catastrophically out of hand. The family connections are worth laying out, because they reveal something almost absurd about the way European power was structured in the early 20th century. George V and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were first cousins. Their mothers were sisters, both daughters of Queen Victoria. George and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were also first cousins. Their mothers were sisters from the Danish royal house. And Wilhelm and Nicholas were connected through multiple lines of royal intermarriage that made their relationship roughly that of third cousins, though the exact degree depends on which genealogical branch you follow and how much patience you have for royal family trees, which tend to loop back on themselves in ways that would concern a geneticist. In practical terms, this meant that the three most powerful rulers in the conflict, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia, were all related to each other closely enough that they could have been seated at the same family dinner table. They had in fact been seated at the same family dinner table on multiple occasions, at weddings, funerals, and the various ceremonial gatherings that European royalty used to maintain the illusion that their interconnected bloodlines guaranteed peace. George and Nicholas had an especially close personal relationship, They had met numerous times, corresponded regularly, and shared a bond that went beyond diplomatic courtesy. They called each other by nicknames in letters, Georgie and Nicky, which is the kind of detail that makes the outbreak of war between their countries feel even more surreal than it already was. They looked so similar that they were frequently mistaken for each other in photographs. Same build, same beard, same neatly trimmed moustache, same vaguely melancholic expression, as if they both sensed that the world they had been born into was not going to last. A famous photograph from a family gathering in 1913 shows them standing side by side in naval uniforms, and the resemblance is so striking that without labels you genuinely cannot tell which one is which. Nature, it seems, had a sense of irony about cousins who would soon find themselves on opposing sides of a global catastrophe. Wilhelm was the more complicated figure. He was brilliant, erratic, insecure, and possessed of a personality that modern psychologists would have found endlessly fascinating and deeply concerning. He had a withered left arm from a difficult birth, a chip on his shoulder roughly the size of the German Empire, and a desperate need to be taken seriously that manifested in increasingly aggressive foreign policy. His relationship with his British relatives was a volatile mix of admiration and resentment. He loved Britain, envied Britain, wanted to impress Britain, and ultimately helped start a war that would devastate both their countries. Family gatherings, one imagines, had been awkward for some time before 1914. George's personal feelings about the outbreak of war were straightforward and deeply felt. He was horrified. Not because he was a pacifist, he was a military man by training and understood that wars sometimes happened, but because this particular war represented a catastrophic failure of the diplomatic system that his family was supposed to embody. The whole point of marrying royals to other royals, of maintaining these intricate networks of cousinage across Europe, was to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. The theory was that rulers who were related to each other would find it harder to go to war against each other. The theory, unfortunately, turned out to be about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Once the war began, George threw himself into the role of wartime monarch with the same conscientiousness that characterized everything he did. He visited troops, he toured hospitals, he inspected factories, he held audiences with generals and politicians, he pinned medals on soldiers and wrote letters of condolence to families who had lost sons, husbands, and fathers. He did everything that was expected of a king in wartime, and he did it with a seriousness and dedication that earned genuine respect from both the military establishment and the general public. The scale of his wartime activity is often underestimated. Over the course of the conflict, George visited the Western Front 7 times. Not quick ceremonial drop-ins, but extended trips that took him close enough to the action that his safety could not be entirely guaranteed. He inspected over 300 military units. He visited hospitals where wounded soldiers lay in conditions that would have tested the composure of anyone, let alone a man who had grown up in the comparative comfort of palaces and country estates. He shook hands with men who were missing limbs, spoke with soldiers who were blind or disfigured, and walked through wards where the smell of antiseptic barely masked the smell of suffering. None of this was publicised at the level it would be today. There were no camera crews following George's every move, no social media posts documenting his hospital visits. He did it because he believed it was his duty, and he asked for no credit beyond the satisfaction of having fulfilled that duty. His relationship with the military leadership was complex. George was a constitutional monarch, which meant he had influence but not command authority. He could advise, encourage, and occasionally pressure, but he could not order generals to change their strategy, or politicians to change their policy. This was, for a man trained in the clear hierarchies of the Royal Navy, a frustrating position. He had opinions about the conduct of the war. He was sceptical of some of the more ambitious offensive plans, and he worried about the human cost of attrition warfare. But his role was to support, not to direct, and he stayed within those boundaries with the discipline of someone who understood that the constitutional limits on his power were not obstacles to be circumvented but principles to be respected. He also made personal sacrifices that, while modest compared to those being made in the trenches, were symbolically important. In April 1915, George took the King's Pledge, a public commitment to abstain from alcohol for the duration of the war, intended as a gesture of solidarity with the workers in munitions factories, where concerns about alcohol-related absenteeism had been raised. The pledge was widely publicised and earned George considerable public approval, though his household found it somewhat less inspiring. The royal cellar remained stocked, and guests at Buckingham Palace were served fruit juice and water with their meals, which reportedly did not improve the quality of dinner conversation. George himself, who enjoyed a drink in the measured way that a naval officer enjoys most things, endured the abstinence with grim determination for the full duration of the conflict. Whether he poured himself something strong on the evening the armistice was signed is not recorded, but one hopes so. There was also one incident during the war that nearly ended George's life and would affect his health permanently. In October 1915, while inspecting troops of the Royal Flying Corps near Hestineuil in France, his horse was startled by the sound of cheering soldiers and reared violently, throwing George to the ground and then falling directly on top of him. The king lay in the mud, unable to move, while his aides rushed to pull the animal off him. He had suffered a fractured pelvis, an injury that was painful, serious, and would cause him recurring health problems for the rest of his life. The pain was so intense that George later said it was the worst physical experience of his entire life, which for a man who had spent years on naval vessels in rough seas and had already endured various ailments, was saying something. The accident was initially downplayed in the press to avoid alarming the public and to prevent any suggestion that the king was not capable of fulfilling his duties. But privately, George spent weeks recovering in considerable agony. He was prescribed painkillers that included morphine, and some historians have suggested that this was the beginning of a dependency on pain medication that would shadow his later years. He returned to his duties as soon as he could walk, because that was what George did. He showed up, even when showing up hurt. The injury never fully healed, and for the rest of his life George walked with a stiffness that he attempted to disguise in public, but that was obvious to anyone who saw him in private. But the most profound challenge the war posed to George was not physical, it was existential. Because as the conflict dragged on, as the casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands and then the millions, as the initial patriotic enthusiasm curdled into exhaustion and grief, a question began to surface in the British press and the British public consciousness that struck at the very foundations of the monarchy. Why was the British king's family German? The question was not new, strictly speaking. The British royal family had been of German extraction since 1714, when George I of Hanover had been invited to take the British throne because he was the nearest Protestant relative of the deceased Queen Anne. George I spoke barely any English when he arrived. His court conducted business in French and German, and his understanding of British politics ranged from minimal to non-existent. But he was Protestant, which was the only qualification that mattered at the time, and the British establishment had decided that a German-speaking king who could not communicate with his own subjects was preferable to a Catholic one who could. The priorities of early 18th century politics were, to put it generously, distinctive. Every British monarch since then had been, by blood and heritage, significantly more German than British. The Hanoverian line produced 4 George and a William before Victoria took the throne. Victoria herself, while born and raised in England, married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a match that was passionately romantic but also profoundly German. Albert redesigned the royal family's Christmas celebrations along German lines, introduced the Christmas tree to British popular culture, and generally made the court at Windsor feel as much like a provincial German duchy as an English palace. Edward VII had married a Danish princess, which was an improvement from a public relations standpoint, but did not change the fundamental German character of the dynasty. And the official name of the royal house, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was about as German as a name could possibly be without actually being written in Gothic script. For most of British history, this had not mattered very much. The aristocracy was thoroughly internationalised, royal marriages were diplomatic instruments, and nobody particularly cared what language the king's great-grandmother had spoken at home. German immigrants had been a respected part of British society for generations. They ran bakeries, taught music, worked in finance, and contributed to every aspect of national life. The royal connection to Germany was seen as unremarkable, even advantageous, a link to one of Europe's most powerful and culturally sophisticated nations. But the First World War changed everything. Suddenly Germany was not a distant cousin but a mortal enemy. German businesses in Britain were being vandalised. German-owned shops had their windows smashed. People with German-sounding names were being harassed, fired, or interned. Even those whose families had lived in Britain for generations and who considered themselves as British as anyone else. Dachshunds, the dogs, were reportedly kicked in the street because they looked too German, which gives you some idea of how far anti-German sentiment had spread and how little it cared about rational targeting. German music was banned from concert halls. German food was renamed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage in some establishments, a tradition of patriotic food renaming that would resurface in various forms throughout the 20th century whenever a particular nation fell out of favour. In this atmosphere, having a royal family named Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was, to put it mildly, a branding problem. The press began raising the issue with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. Questions were asked in Parliament. Pamphlets circulated. The novelist H.G. Wells published an article referring to the monarchy as an alien and uninspiring court, which prompted George to respond with characteristic bluntness that he might be uninspiring, but he was damned if he was alien. Mary's position was even more complicated. Her father, as we covered earlier, was the Duke of Teck, a German title from a German noble family in the Kingdom of Württemberg. Mary had been born in England, raised in England, and was as British as anyone whose family tree included half the royal houses of Europe could reasonably claim to be. But in wartime, nuance was in short supply. The fact that the Queen of England had a German father was, for the anti-German press, a gift that kept on giving. Mary dealt with this by doing what she always did. She kept working, kept appearing in public, kept visiting hospitals and factories, and refused to dignify the accusations with a response. It was a strategy that required enormous composure and a skin thick enough to stop small-caliber bullets. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 1917. The trigger was, of all things, a bombing raid. On June 13th, German Gotha bombers, yes, the planes were actually called Gothas, attacked London in broad daylight, causing significant casualties and even greater public outrage. The raid targeted the East End, hitting a primary school in Poplar, where 18 children were among those who lost their lives. The public fury was immense, and it was directed not just at Germany, but at anything and anyone with a German connection. Shops with German-sounding names were attacked. Families with German heritage faced threats and intimidation. And in the background of all this anger, the coincidence of the bombers sharing a name with the royal house was the kind of public relations disaster that no amount of careful messaging could survive. The newspapers made the connection immediately and gleefully. Editorial cartoons practically drew themselves. The message was clear. It was time for the royal family to stop being Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The situation was further complicated by the presence of several German-titled relatives still living in Britain. George's own cousins bore German titles and German names. Prince Louis of Battenberg, who had served as First Sea Lord at the start of the war, had already been forced to resign in 1914 because of anti-German sentiment, despite having lived in Britain for most of his life and having served the Royal Navy with distinction for decades. The message was clear. German names were not just unpopular, they were becoming dangerous. George agreed. The question was what to replace it with. The process of selecting a new name was, by several accounts, more complicated than you might expect. This was not like naming a pet or choosing a brand for a new product. This was the name that would define a dynasty, potentially for centuries. It had to carry weight, history, and emotional resonance. It had to sound British without sounding contrived. It had to be available, which in the world of royal nomenclature meant it could not already belong to another active dynasty, or carry associations that might prove embarrassing. Various options were proposed and rejected in what must have been one of the more unusual committee meetings in British history. Plantagenet was considered and dismissed. Too medieval, too associated with civil war, and too likely to make people think of Shakespeare rather than the current king. Tudor was floated and abandoned, too closely linked to a specific period, and besides, the Tudor line had ended with Elizabeth I, which carried awkward implications about dynastic continuity. York was suggested and set aside. Too regional, and it was already being used as a title for George's second son. Lancaster was mentioned and passed over for similar reasons. Fitzroy was apparently proposed by someone, though what exactly they were thinking is unclear, given that the name literally means son of the king, and had historically been given to royal illegitimate children. Not exactly the fresh start George was looking for. The solution came from Lord Stamfordham, George's private secretary, a man whose contribution to the survival of the British monarchy is vastly underappreciated. Stamfordham suggested Windsor, the name of the castle that had been a royal residence since the time of William the Conqueror. It was English, it was familiar, it was associated with nearly 1,000 years of royal history, and it sounded reassuringly solid in a way that Saxe-Coburg-Gotha manifestly did not. George approved it immediately. On July 17th, 1917, a royal proclamation was issued declaring that the royal house would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. All German titles held by members of the British royal family were renounced. The Tecks became Cambridges, the Battenbergs became Mountbattens, a translation so literal it was almost comical, but it worked. Prince Louis of Battenberg, the former First Sea Lord who had been hounded from office for his German name, became Louis Mountbatten, Marquis of Milford Haven. His son, also Louis, would later become Lord Mountbatten of Burma and play a significant role in the history of the British Empire's final chapter in India, a neat historical rhyme that nobody in 1917 could have anticipated. An entire layer of German identity was stripped away in a single administrative act and replaced with something that sounded as if it had been British all along. The proclamation also affected dozens of lesser-known royals and aristocrats whose German titles were suddenly liabilities rather than assets. Some accepted the change with grace, others found it deeply painful. These were not just names, but identities, family histories, and connections to a heritage that, whatever its current political inconvenience, was genuinely part of who they were. The Anglicisation of the royal family was, in a sense, an act of cultural amputation, necessary for survival perhaps, but not painless. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Newspapers praised the decision. The general public, exhausted by 3 years of war and in no mood for nuance, welcomed the change as proof that the royal family was truly British and truly on their side. There were some dissenting voices. A few observers pointed out that changing your name did not actually change your blood, and that the king was just as German on July 18th as he had been on July 16th. But these voices were drowned out by the general applause. In wartime, symbolism matters more than substance, and the symbolism of the name change was exactly what the country needed. The irony, naturally, was considerable. Windsor Castle had been built by William the Conqueror, a Frenchman from Normandy who had invaded England in 1066 and imposed his rule by force. The most British-sounding name the royal family could find was, in historical terms, just as foreign as the one it replaced. But by 1917, the conquest was nearly 900 years in the past, and nobody was especially worried about Norman cultural imperialism. The name worked, it stuck, and the House of Windsor was born. Kaiser Wilhelm, upon hearing about the name change, reportedly made a joke about going to see a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. It was one of his better lines, though it is worth noting that he was in the middle of losing a world war at the time, so perhaps his sense of humour was sharpened by desperation. The name change was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental shift in how the British monarchy understood itself. For 2 centuries, the royal family had been openly, unapologetically European, connected by blood and marriage to virtually every ruling house on the continent, operating within an international aristocratic network that transcended national borders. The war destroyed that network. The empires that had sustained it, Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, were collapsing one by one. The world of interconnected royal cousins who traded princesses like diplomatic currency was coming to an end, and the British monarchy, if it wanted to survive, needed to become something new, not a European institution that happened to be based in Britain, but a specifically and emphatically British institution that could serve as a symbol of national identity in a world where national identity suddenly mattered more than royal blood. George understood this, perhaps more instinctively than intellectually. He was not a man of grand theoretical vision. He did not sit in his study reading political philosophy and developing abstract frameworks for constitutional monarchy. He was a practical man who read the newspapers, listened to his advisers, and paid attention to what ordinary people were feeling. And what ordinary people were feeling, by 1917, was a deep and justified anger at the establishment that had led them into the most devastating war in human history. Monarchies were falling across Europe. The Tsar had been overthrown in February 1917, and the Kaiser would be forced to abdicate in November 1918. The idea that the British monarchy was somehow immune to revolutionary pressure was a comforting fantasy, not a guaranteed fact. The fall of the Tsar hit particularly close to home for George. Nicholas II was not just a fellow monarch. He was a first cousin, a man who looked almost identical to George, a man with whom he had exchanged friendly letters for decades. When the Russian Revolution forced Nicholas to abdicate in March 1917, the question arose almost immediately. Should Britain offer the former Tsar and his family asylum? The initial impulse of the British government, under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, was to extend the offer. But George, and this remains one of the most debated decisions of his reign, intervened to have the offer withdrawn. His private secretary Lord Stamfordham wrote to the Foreign Office, expressing the king's concern that bringing the Romanovs to Britain would associate the crown with the deeply unpopular Russian autocracy and potentially inflame revolutionary sentiment at home. The decision has been judged harshly by historians, and it is not difficult to see why. Nicholas and his family were eventually taken by the Bolsheviks to Yekaterinburg, where they met an end that defies comfortable description in a video intended for general audiences. Whether British asylum would have changed that outcome is unknowable. The logistics of extracting the Romanovs from revolutionary Russia were formidable, regardless of British willingness. But the fact remains that George chose the survival of his own institution over the safety of his own cousin. It was a cold calculation, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. He reportedly never spoke about the decision publicly, and deflected any private questions about it with visible discomfort. It was, perhaps, the starkest illustration of what the monarchy demanded of the man who wore the crown, that when institutional survival and personal loyalty came into conflict, the institution won. Always. George's response to the broader revolutionary threat was to make the monarchy more visible, more accessible, and more explicitly identified with the British people rather than with the European aristocracy. The name change was the most dramatic step, but it was part of a broader strategy that included more frequent public appearances, more visible identification with ordinary wartime hardships, and a deliberate effort to position the crown as a servant of the nation rather than its master. This was not democracy in any formal sense. George was still a hereditary monarch with significant constitutional powers. But it was a recognition that the monarchy's survival depended on popular consent, and that popular consent had to be actively earned, not passively assumed. The war ended on November 11, 1918, and when it did, the map of Europe looked almost nothing like it had 4 years earlier. The German Empire was gone, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone, the Russian Empire was gone, the Ottoman Empire was gone. 4 great imperial dynasties had been swept away, and in their place stood a collection of new nations, republics, and fragile democracies that were still figuring out how to govern themselves. The human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Roughly 17 million people had perished, millions more were wounded, displaced, or psychologically shattered, and an entire generation of young men had been reduced in numbers so dramatically that the demographic consequences would be felt for decades. Britain alone had lost nearly 1 million soldiers. Every town, every village, every family had been touched by the conflict. The war memorials that began appearing in communities across the country were not abstract tributes to distant heroism. They listed the names of neighbours, friends, brothers, and sons. Of the major European monarchies that had entered the war, only 2 survived intact, the British and the Belgian. And the British monarchy survived not because it was stronger or more legitimate than the others, but because it had been willing to adapt, to change its name, to shed its German skin, and to reinvent itself as something that the British public could still believe in. On Armistice Day itself, George and Mary appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to greet a crowd that had gathered spontaneously in the streets below. The celebrations were enormous. People sang, embraced strangers, wept with relief, and cheered for a king who, whatever his limitations, had shared their suffering in a way that felt genuine. George waved. Mary stood beside him. They did not embrace. This was still George and Mary after all. But the moment was real, and the connection between the crown and the crowd was for that brief afternoon as strong as it had ever been. The monarchy had survived the greatest test in its modern history. It had emerged diminished in some ways, smaller, less grand, more explicitly dependent on public goodwill, but also more resilient, more adaptable, and more firmly rooted in the national identity than it had been when the first shots were fired in 1914. George and Mary emerged from the war years exhausted but intact. Their partnership had been tested by 4 years of relentless pressure. The emotional toll of visiting wounded soldiers, the political strain of managing a wartime monarchy, the personal pain of George's injury, and the constant low-level anxiety of ruling a country that was fighting for its survival. They had met every challenge with the same quiet, stubborn, emotionally restrained determination that defined their entire relationship. They had not failed, they had not broken, they had endured, and they had, almost accidentally, created something new. The House of Windsor was not just a new name, it was a new concept, a monarchy that derived its legitimacy not from divine right or military conquest or royal blood, but from its relationship with the people it served. George had not set out to revolutionize the institution he inherited. He had set out to survive, but in surviving, he had laid the groundwork for a modern constitutional monarchy that would endure for the rest of the century and beyond. The name Windsor would be carried by George's son, his granddaughter, and his great-grandson. It would become synonymous with the British Crown itself, so thoroughly embedded in the national consciousness that most people today have no idea it was invented in a moment of wartime panic by a private secretary with a talent for branding. The house that George built, or rather renamed, would face challenges that he could never have imagined, but it would face them as the Windsors, and that, more than any treaty or proclamation or military victory, was the most lasting consequence of the War of Cousins. While George was navigating the constitutional and political storms of wartime monarchy, Mary was fighting her own war, quieter, less visible in the history books, but no less significant for the survival of the crown, because if George's job during the First World War was to hold the institution together from the top, Mary's job was to connect it to the ground. And she did this with a relentless, methodical, almost industrial efficiency that transformed the role of Queen Consort from decorative accessory to active national asset. Before the war, the duties of a British Queen Consort were, to be blunt, mostly ceremonial. You attended events, you wore the right clothes, you smiled at the right people, you patronised charities in the genteel, hands-off way that aristocratic women had been patronising charities for centuries, lending your name, attending the occasional fundraising dinner, and trusting that the professionals would handle the actual work. It was a role defined more by what you represented than by what you did. The Queen Consort was expected to be beautiful, or at least presentable. She was expected to produce heirs. She was expected to support her husband publicly and manage his household privately. She was expected to be interested in cultural matters in a general, non-threatening way, patronising the arts, encouraging education, expressing concern for the welfare of women and children in language that was sympathetic but never so specific as to suggest she might actually be trying to change anything. And for most queen consorts in British history, that had been perfectly sufficient. The role was comfortable, well-defined, and entirely devoid of anything that could be mistaken for real power or independent agency. Mary did not find it sufficient. Whether this was because of her personality, her Florentine education that had taught her to look at the world with analytical eyes, her sense of duty, or simply the unprecedented demands of the situation, she approached the war years with an energy and purposefulness that caught even her own household by surprise. She did not sit in Buckingham Palace waiting for news from the front. She went out. She went out constantly. She went out in rain, in cold, in conditions that would have deterred someone with less determination and a more sensible pair of shoes. She went out so often and to so many places that her schedule during the war years reads less like a queen's diary and more like the itinerary of a particularly ambitious travelling salesperson who also happened to own a tiara. The numbers tell part of the story. Before the war, the royal household conducted a certain number of official visits and public engagements each year, enough to maintain visibility without exhausting anyone's patience, including the royals themselves. Mary effectively tripled that number during the conflict. She visited hospitals, not one or two hospitals as a symbolic gesture, but dozens of hospitals repeatedly across the country. She became such a regular presence in some wards that the nursing staff began expecting her the way they expected supply deliveries, on schedule and with a clear sense of purpose. She toured munitions factories where women were filling shells with explosives in conditions that were, even by the relaxed safety standards of the era, genuinely hazardous. The women working in these factories handled TNT and other chemicals with minimal protective equipment, and many of them developed jaundice from the exposure. Their skin turned yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Mary saw these women, spoke with them, and understood viscerally what the war was costing the people who would never appear in any history book. She inspected military camps, relief centres, food distribution points, and volunteer organisations. She went to the East End of London, where bombing raids had caused destruction and suffering, and she walked through streets that most people of her social class had never seen and would have preferred not to. The contrast between the world Mary inhabited, Buckingham Palace, with its 600 rooms and its army of servants, and the world she was visiting, cramped terraced houses, overcrowded shelters, wards filled with men who would never walk again, was stark enough to shock anyone. Mary absorbed it without flinching, at least outwardly. Whatever she felt privately, and her diary entries suggest she felt a great deal, she maintained the composure that was expected of her, and channeled her emotions into action rather than display. She also visited convalescent homes where soldiers recovering from injuries were learning new skills to prepare for a civilian life that would be profoundly different from the one they had left behind. Men who had been farm workers, factory hands, and clerks were now learning to function with missing limbs, damaged lungs, or psychological wounds that the era had no vocabulary for and barely any treatment. Mary spoke with these men individually, listened to their stories, and in many cases followed up with personal letters or practical assistance arranged through her office. She was not merely visiting, she was witnessing, and she was ensuring that the Crown witnessed too. These were not photo opportunities in the modern sense. There were no camera crews following Mary around, no press officers managing her image, no social media team posting updates. Many of her visits were barely reported in the newspapers at all. She went because she believed it was her duty, because she wanted to understand what was actually happening to the people her husband's government was asking to sacrifice everything, and because she had an instinct, shared with George, but expressed in a very different way, that the monarchy needed to be seen sharing in the national suffering if it expected to survive the national reckoning that would inevitably follow the war. Her approach to these visits was characteristically Mary, thorough, observant, and occasionally disconcerting to the people she was visiting. She did not just shake hands and offer sympathetic platitudes. She asked questions, detailed questions, questions about working conditions, supply chains, production targets, and staffing levels. She wanted to know how things worked, what was going wrong, and what could be done better. Factory managers who expected a brief royal walkthrough followed by tea and a handshake found themselves instead being interrogated by a queen who had done her homework and was genuinely interested in the answers. It was not exactly what most people expected from a woman wearing pearls and a hat, but it was effective. One of Mary's most significant wartime initiatives was the creation of the Queen Mary Needlework Guild. The name sounds quaint. Needlework conjures images of gentlewomen doing embroidery by the fireside, which is approximately the least warlike activity imaginable. But the guild was, in practice, a large-scale logistics operation designed to supply the armed forces and military hospitals with essential textile goods. Mary organised networks of women across the country, aristocrats, middle-class volunteers, and working-class seamstresses alike, to produce socks, scarves, gloves, bandages, shirts, and other items that were desperately needed at the front. The scale of production was remarkable. Over the course of the war, the Guild produced and distributed millions of items. Socks alone ran into the hundreds of thousands, which is an almost incomprehensible quantity of hand-knitted hosiery, and suggests a national knitting effort that would have impressed even the most ambitious yarn shop owner. Mary oversaw the operation with the organisational skill of someone who could have run a mid-sized corporation if circumstances had been different, and if the early 20th century had been remotely interested in allowing women to run corporations. She established quality control standards. Items that did not meet the required specifications were sent back to be redone, because Mary was not interested in well-intentioned but poorly constructed socks reaching soldiers who needed functional ones. She coordinated distribution networks that connected production centres across the country, with shipping points that could get supplies to the front lines, military hospitals, and prisoner-of-war relief organisations. She ensured that supplies reached where they were needed rather than piling up in warehouses or being diverted to less critical uses. This was harder than it sounds. The logistics of wartime supply were chaotic, bureaucratic, and frequently at odds with common sense. Items that were desperately needed in one location would sit in storage at another while paperwork was processed. Mary's running a nationwide volunteer production network while simultaneously maintaining a full schedule of public appearances, managing the royal household's austerity program, and supporting her husband through the political crises of wartime governance would have been an impressive workload for a professional administrator with a full staff. For a queen who was also expected to look immaculate at every public appearance and maintain the serene composure of someone for whom nothing was ever too much trouble, it was extraordinary. The genius of the Needlework Guild, beyond its practical utility, was that it gave women across the social spectrum a way to contribute to the war effort that was both meaningful and accessible. You did not need to be wealthy to knit socks. You did not need a university education to sew shirts. The Guild democratized wartime service in a way that was quietly revolutionary. It brought together women from different classes, different backgrounds, and different parts of the country around a shared purpose, and it did so under the personal direction of the Queen. This was not an aristocratic charity dispensing aid from on high. It was a collaborative effort, and Mary's willingness to work alongside women she would never have encountered in normal royal life was noticed and appreciated. This spirit of cross-class collaboration found its most striking expression in Mary's relationship with Mary MacArthur. MacArthur was a trade union activist, a socialist, and a fierce advocate for working women's rights. In other words, exactly the kind of person that a queen consort would normally have had absolutely no contact with. The social distance between Buckingham Palace and the trade union movement was, in Edwardian and Georgian England, roughly equivalent to the distance between the Earth and the Moon, and about as frequently traversed. The idea that the Queen and a union organiser might work together on anything would have seemed, before the war, approximately as likely as the idea that cats and dogs might collaborate on a research paper. But the war made unlikely partnerships possible, and Mary and MacArthur found common ground in their shared concern for the welfare of working women. MacArthur had been campaigning for years about the conditions in which women worked, the low wages, the long hours, the hazardous environments, the lack of legal protections. She had organised strikes, written pamphlets, given speeches, and generally made herself as inconvenient as possible to employers who preferred their workforce quiet and compliant. She was tireless, articulate, and possessed of the kind of moral conviction that made people either deeply admire her or deeply wish she would go away. They worked on farms through the Women's Land Army. They served as nurses, ambulance drivers, and telephone operators close to the front lines. This expansion was economically essential. Without female labour, the British war economy would have collapsed, but it was also socially disruptive. Women were doing work that society had told them they were incapable of doing, earning money they had never had access to, and developing a sense of independence that would have long-term consequences for the social order. It created new problems that neither the government nor the traditional charitable sector was equipped to handle. Problems of exploitation, safety, childcare for working mothers, and the fundamental question of what would happen to these women once the men came home and wanted their jobs back. Mary and MacArthur began working together on initiatives to support these women, improving working conditions in munitions factories, establishing welfare programs for female workers, and advocating for better wages and protections. The issues were real and urgent. Women in munitions plants worked 12-hour shifts in buildings with poor ventilation, handling chemicals that cause skin rashes, respiratory problems, and worse. They were paid significantly less than the men they had replaced, on the theory that women's labour was inherently less valuable, a theory that the women themselves found unconvincing, but that the industrial establishment clung to with remarkable tenacity. Workplace injuries were common, and the support available to women who were hurt on the job was minimal at best. The Queen provided access, visibility, and the institutional weight of the Crown. When Mary endorsed an initiative, doors opened that would have remained firmly shut for a trade unionist alone. Government ministers who could comfortably ignore a letter from a union organiser found it considerably harder to ignore one that arrived with the implicit backing of the Queen. The union organiser, for her part, provided expertise, connections to the working class, and the kind of blunt honesty about conditions on the ground that Mary's usual advisers were unlikely to deliver. MacArthur did not soften her language for royal ears. She described what she saw in plain terms, and Mary, to her credit, listened without requiring the reality to be wrapped in diplomatic cushioning. It was an improbable partnership, but it worked precisely because both women were more interested in getting things done than in observing the social niceties that were supposed to keep them apart. The relationship was not without its awkward moments, and the partnership was brief. MacArthur passed away in 1921 at the age of just 40, but its impact outlasted both women's direct involvement. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace itself, Mary was implementing changes that were as much about symbolism as substance. though the substance was real enough. She introduced an austerity regime that reduced the household's consumption of food, fuel, and other resources to levels that would demonstrate solidarity with a nation under rationing. The palace menus were simplified. Gone were the elaborate multi-course dinners that had been standard under Edward VII, replaced by meals that were substantial but plain. Portions were reduced. Exotic or expensive ingredients were eliminated. The kitchen staff, who had been accustomed to producing the kind of cuisine that would have satisfied a Michelin inspector, found themselves working with the same limited ingredients that every other household in Britain was managing with, albeit in considerably larger quantities. The heating was turned down, which in a building the size of Buckingham Palace during an English winter was not so much an austerity measure as an endurance test. The palace corridors became positively Arctic. Staff wore extra layers and visitors were advised to bring warm clothing. Unused rooms were sealed off to save fuel. The gardens were partially converted to grow vegetables, cabbages and carrots where ornamental flowers had bloomed, a powerful visual statement even if the yield would not feed a nation. These measures saved relatively little in absolute terms. The royal household's consumption, even at its most extravagant, was a rounding error in the national economy. But the point was never the money. The point was the message, that the royal family was willing to share in the privations that ordinary people were enduring, that the crown did not consider itself exempt from the sacrifices that the nation was making. In an era when the gap between rich and poor was enormous, and when revolutionary sentiment was spreading across Europe, this kind of visible solidarity was not just good manners, it was survival strategy. Mary also understood something that George, for all his other qualities, sometimes missed: the importance of the personal touch. George was good at the big symbolic gestures, the speeches, the proclamations, the formal ceremonies. Mary was good at the small human interactions that made people feel seen and valued. When she visited a hospital, she did not. There is something admirable about a woman who overcomes her own temperamental limitations to meet the demands of her position, and Mary did this consistently throughout the war years with a discipline that matched her husband's. The cumulative effect was a transformation of the Queen Consort's role that would echo for the rest of the century. This model, the Queen as servant of the nation, the Queen as worker, the Queen as connector between the palace and the people, would become the template for future generations of royal women. Elizabeth II, who grew up watching her grandmother navigate the demands of public life, absorbed these lessons and applied them throughout her own record-breaking reign. The image of the young Princess Elizabeth joining the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service during the Second World War, learning to drive military vehicles, getting her hands dirty with engine grease, was a direct descendant of Mary's wartime example. The idea that a queen should work, should serve, should be visibly committed to the welfare of her people was not something that Elizabeth invented. It was something she inherited from the woman who had knitted socks, inspected munitions factories, and collaborated with trade unionists while her husband was busy trying to keep the crown on his head. When the war finally ended and the nation began the slow, painful process of recovery, the British public looked for ways to express their gratitude to the people who had led them through the crisis. George received his thanks in the form of continued public support and the quiet satisfaction of having held the institution together. Mary received something rather more unusual, and in its own peculiar way rather more Mary. In the early 1920s, a project was conceived to create a gift for the Queen that would celebrate British craftsmanship and serve as a permanent tribute to the nation's gratitude. The result was Queen Mary's Doll's House. And if you are imagining a small wooden structure with a few tiny chairs and a miniature kitchen, you are dramatically underestimating both the ambition of the project and the British capacity for taking a simple idea and making it absurdly elaborate. The Doll's House was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, one of the most celebrated architects of the age, the same man who designed New Delhi and the Cenotaph on Whitehall. It was built to a scale of 1 inch to 1 foot and contained approximately 1,500 individually crafted miniature objects. The level of detail was extraordinary, bordering on obsessive. The house had working electricity. It had running water, actual running water, through actual tiny pipes. It had working elevators. The wine cellar was stocked with real bottles of wine, each about the size of a thimble. The library contained 200 books, each roughly an inch tall, with real text written by real authors: Rudyard Kipling, Arthur Conan Doyle, Thomas Hardy, and dozens of others, had contributed original miniature work specifically for the collection. The paintings on the walls were real miniature paintings by real artists. The crown jewels in the strong room were real miniature reproductions made with actual gold and precious stones. The project took 3 years to complete and involved over 1,500 craftspeople: painters, carpenters, silversmiths, textile workers, plumbers, electricians, bookbinders, and specialists in disciplines so niche that they probably did not have formal names. Every element was made to the highest standard, using the same materials and techniques that would be used for a full-size version. The tiny Rolls-Royce in the garage was made by Rolls-Royce. The actual company devoted actual engineering hours to building a car that could fit in the palm of your hand, which is either a magnificent testament to British craftsmanship or the most elaborate use of company resources in automotive history, depending on your perspective. The tiny shotguns in the gunroom were made by actual gunsmiths, with working mechanisms at 1/12th scale. The stamps in the miniature stamp collection were real stamps, a detail that George, with his lifelong passion for philately, would have appreciated more than anyone. The gramophone played actual music from a record the size of a coin. The tiny bottles in the wine cellar contained real wine and spirits, carefully decanted into containers so small that their contents could not have intoxicated a particularly abstemious mouse. The bathroom had working taps, the toilets flushed. The kitchen was equipped with miniature pots, pans, and utensils that were functional at their tiny scale. Even the drains worked. Water entered the house through one system and exited through another, because apparently when the British decide to do something, they do not believe in cutting corners, even on plumbing that no one will ever actually use. The literary contributions were perhaps the most remarkable element. Over 170 authors and poets contributed original works written specifically for the Doll's House Library. These were not excerpts or reprints. They were brand new pieces, composed at miniature length, handwritten on tiny pages and bound in tiny leather covers. Rudyard Kipling contributed a poem. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a miniature Sherlock Holmes story. M.R. James contributed a ghost story. The poet laureate Robert Bridges provided a manuscript. These were the most celebrated writers of their generation, and they had all agreed to produce work that would be read, if anyone could read it without a magnifying glass, inside a doll's house. The literary establishment of 1920s Britain had collectively decided that this project was worthy of their time, which tells you something about both the national mood and the esteem in which Mary was held. Was it excessive? Absolutely. Was it gloriously, unapologetically, magnificently excessive? Without question. The Doll's House was, in many ways, the most British object ever created, a monument to craftsmanship, attention to detail, and the national instinct for taking something simple and making it unreasonably complicated. It was also, beneath the whimsy and the miniature plumbing, a genuine expression of national affection for a queen who had earned it through years of quiet, relentless service. Mary, unsurprisingly, loved it. The woman who had spent her youth in Florence studying art and collecting beautiful objects, who had built a reputation as one of the most discerning collectors in the royal family's history, was presented with what was essentially the world's most elaborate collector's item. It was a gift perfectly calibrated to its recipient, a tribute that understood not just what Mary had done during the war, but who she was as a person. The Doll's House was first exhibited publicly at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924, where it drew enormous crowds. People who had spent the war years living in cramped, cold, rationed conditions came to marvel at a tiny, perfect house where everything worked, everything was beautiful, and nothing was broken. There was something therapeutic about it, a miniature world of order and craftsmanship in a full-sized world that still bore the scars of chaos and destruction. The Doll's House remains on display at Windsor Castle to this day, where it continues to attract hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, each of whom presumably leaves with the same slightly dazed expression that comes from spending half an hour examining a house where even the toilet paper is to scale. Mary's war had been different from George's, but it had been no less important. She had not made speeches or signed proclamations. She had not navigated constitutional crises or renamed the dynasty. She had done something arguably harder. She had taken a role that was essentially ceremonial and turned it into something substantive, something that mattered, something that connected the crown to the lives of ordinary people in ways that no previous queen consort had attempted. She had done it without fanfare, without self-promotion, and without ever once stepping outside the boundaries of what was expected of a queen. She had simply expanded those boundaries until they encompassed an entirely new definition of what a queen could be. The war was over, but peace turned out to be almost as difficult as the conflict itself. The 1920s arrived not with the celebratory optimism that the word peace might suggest, but with a series of crises that tested George's skills as a constitutional monarch in ways the war never had. On the battlefield, at least, the lines had been clear. Britain was fighting an external enemy, and the king's job was to support the national effort. In peacetime, the enemies were internal, the lines were blurred, and the king's job was to navigate between competing factions of his own people without appearing to take sides. For a man who preferred straightforward naval discipline to the murky waters of politics, it was not exactly a comfortable position. The most dangerous of these peacetime crises was Ireland. The Irish question had been poisoning British politics for centuries, and by 1920 it had reached a point of acute violence that threatened to tear the United Kingdom apart. The basic problem was deceptively simple. A large proportion of the Irish population wanted independence from Britain, and a smaller but fiercely committed minority in the north wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. The solutions were anything but simple. Home Rule, a form of limited self-governance within the British framework, had been debated, promised, delayed, and fought over for decades. The Easter Rising of 1916 had demonstrated that armed resistance was not a theoretical possibility, but an operational reality. The subsequent War of Independence, fought between Irish Republican forces and British Crown forces from 1919 to 1921, was brutal, dirty, and conducted with a level of mutual atrocity that made conventional diplomacy increasingly difficult. George watched the situation in Ireland with growing alarm. He was not, by temperament or conviction, a man who enjoyed conflict, and the Irish conflict was particularly troubling because it involved British forces engaged in actions against British subjects on what was, legally at least, British soil. Reports of reprisals, burnings, and civilian casualties disturbed him deeply. The deployment of the Black and Tans, auxiliary forces recruited largely from British war veterans and notorious for their indiscipline and brutality, was something George found especially distressing. He said privately that he was ashamed of the behaviour of Crown forces in Ireland, which was a remarkably strong statement for a constitutional monarch who was supposed to remain above political commentary. By the spring of 1921, the situation had reached a point where both sides were exhausted, and a political settlement was becoming not just desirable, but necessary. The Government of Ireland Act of 1920 had partitioned the island into Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, each with its own parliament. Northern Ireland's parliament was due to open in June 1921, and George was invited to attend the ceremony in Belfast. His advisers were divided on whether he should go. The security risks were real. Ireland was effectively a war zone, and putting the king in Belfast was not exactly a low-risk proposition. But George, after consultation with the South African statesman Jan Smuts, decided not only to attend but to use the occasion to deliver a speech that would go well beyond the usual ceremonial pleasantries. The speech George delivered at Belfast City Hall on June 22, 1921, was one of the most important addresses ever given by a British monarch. It was carefully crafted. George worked on it with Smuts and his own advisers, but it carried the weight of personal conviction. He appealed directly for reconciliation, for forgiveness, and for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. He spoke of his earnest desire for the people of Ireland to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land which they loved a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. The language was formal, as royal language always was, but the message was unmistakable. The king was calling for an end to the fighting and an opening of negotiations. The impact was immediate and significant. The speech shifted the political atmosphere in a way that months of behind-the-scenes diplomacy had failed to achieve. It gave the British government political cover to open formal negotiations with Sinn Féin. It signalled to the Irish Republican leadership that the highest level of the British establishment was willing to discuss peace seriously. Within weeks of the Belfast speech, a truce was declared. By December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty had been signed, leading to the creation of the Irish Free State. The treaty was far from perfect. It left the question of Northern Ireland unresolved in ways that would have consequences for the rest of the century. But it ended the immediate violence and established a framework for Irish self-governance that, with modifications, would eventually produce the modern Republic of Ireland. George's role in all of this was precisely what a constitutional monarch's role should be: influential but not directive, symbolic but not merely symbolic. He did not negotiate the treaty. He did not order the truce. He did not make policy. What he did was create a moment of moral authority that gave the political process room to breathe. The Belfast speech demonstrated that the king could be a force for peace, a voice of moderation in a polarised situation, without overstepping the constitutional limits on his power. The personal risk George took in delivering that speech should not be underestimated. Belfast in June 1921 was not a safe city. Armed men on both sides of the conflict operated openly in its streets. The security operation required to protect the king was enormous, and even then his safety could not be fully guaranteed. Mary, who accompanied him, was reportedly calm throughout the visit, or at least appeared calm, which was, in the case of Mary, largely the same thing. She understood, as George did, that the symbolism of the king appearing in person in Belfast amid the conflict was precisely what gave the speech its power. A message read from the safety of Buckingham Palace would not have had the same impact. It needed to be delivered on Irish soil, in an Irish city, in front of an audience that included people on both sides of the divide. The Anglo-Irish treaty that followed in December 1921 was far from a clean resolution. It created the Irish Free State as a dominion within the British Empire, essentially the same status as Canada or Australia, but it excluded the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which remained part of the United Kingdom. This partition was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, and left wounds that would take the rest of the century to even begin healing. The treaty also triggered a civil war in Ireland between those who accepted the compromise and those who rejected it as a betrayal of the Republican ideal. George watched these developments with the helpless concern of a man who had done his best to foster peace, and was now watching peace prove to be almost as violent as war. But the Belfast speech remained a landmark, a demonstration that the monarchy could play a constructive role in the most intractable political conflicts, not through power, but through moral authority. It was, in many ways, the finest single act of George's reign, and it is one of the least remembered. History tends to credit the politicians who signed the treaty, not the king who created the conditions for them to sit down at the table. Barely 5 years later, George found himself navigating a domestic crisis of a very different kind, but one that was, in its own way, just as threatening to social stability. The General Strike of 1926 was the largest industrial action in British history. It began on May 4th and lasted 9 days, during which time approximately 1.7 million workers, miners, transport workers, printers, dockers, ironworkers, and steel workers walked off their jobs in support of the coal miners who had been locked out by mine owners demanding longer hours and lower wages. The underlying cause was economic. British coal had become uncompetitive on the world market, and the mine owners' solution was to squeeze the workers rather than invest in modernisation. The miners' response, encapsulated in their slogan "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day," was a refusal to accept that the burden of economic adjustment should fall entirely on the people who actually dug the coal out of the ground. The country experienced disruption on a scale that nobody alive had witnessed before. Trains stopped running, newspapers stopped printing, which meant that for the first time since the invention of the modern press, the British public was getting its news from the BBC rather than from print, an accidental boost to the radio medium that would have significant consequences. Buses, trams and lorries stood idle in depots. Factories fell silent. Docks closed. In London, the streets had an eerie quality, the usual traffic noise replaced by an unfamiliar quiet, broken only by the sound of volunteer-driven vehicles manned by university students and middle-class men who treated strike-breaking as something between a civic duty and an adventure sport. The sight of young gentlemen in tweeds attempting to drive buses with varying degrees of competence was, depending on your political sympathies, either inspiring or infuriating. The government, under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, mobilised the armed forces to maintain essential services and deployed troops to key locations. The atmosphere was tense. There were isolated incidents of confrontation between strikers and police, though the violence was considerably less than many had feared. The British working class conducted its general strike with a peculiar restraint that observers from more revolutionary countries found almost baffling. There were reports of strikers and police playing football together during breaks in the picketing, which is either a heartwarming testament to British civility or evidence that neither side was taking the situation as seriously as it deserved. George's sympathies, to the discomfort of his Conservative government, were not entirely with the establishment. This was surprising, given that George was in almost every respect a conservative man. He valued tradition, respected hierarchy, and instinctively distrusted radical change. But he was also a man who had spent the war years visiting working-class communities, talking to ordinary people, and developing an understanding of their lives that most of his class did not share. He had seen the conditions in which miners worked, the dark, dangerous, physically punishing reality of life underground, and he had enough basic human empathy to understand why men who spent their days extracting coal from the earth might object to being told they needed to work longer for less money. During the strike, George reportedly urged Baldwin to adopt a conciliatory approach. The exact words he used have been reported in various forms, but the substance was clear. The king believed that the government should try to see the situation from the workers' perspective, rather than treating the strike purely as a challenge to authority. He is credited with telling Baldwin something along the lines of, "Try living on their wages before you judge them." Whether the phrasing was precisely that is disputed, but the sentiment is well documented. George wanted the government to negotiate, not to crush. He wanted a settlement, not a victory. This was constitutionally awkward. The king was not supposed to take sides in an industrial dispute, and George's advisers were acutely aware that even the appearance of royal sympathy for the strikers could be politically explosive. Baldwin's government was firmly committed to breaking the strike, and the last thing they needed was the king publicly undermining their position. George, to his credit, kept his opinions private. He did not make public statements in support of the workers, and he did not interfere directly with government policy. But his behind-the-scenes influence pushed toward moderation, and his general posture during the crisis was one of concern for all his subjects, not just the ones who owned the mines. The strike ended after 9 days, largely on the government's terms. The Trades Union Congress called off the general action without securing the concessions the miners had demanded, which left the miners feeling betrayed by their own allies. The miners themselves held out longer. They continued their strike until November, a full 7 months, during which time mining communities endured genuine hardship. Families went hungry, children went cold, savings were exhausted, credit at local shops was stretched to its limits and beyond. When hunger and cold finally forced the miners back to work on the owners' conditions, longer hours, lower pay, exactly what they had struck to prevent, the defeat was total, and its bitterness would shape the politics of mining communities for generations. The outcome was, by any measure, a defeat for organised labour and a warning about the limits of industrial action as a political weapon. But George's conduct during the crisis added to his growing reputation as a king who genuinely cared about the welfare of ordinary people, not just as an abstract political principle, but as a personal conviction that influenced how he exercised his limited but real influence. He had not saved the miners. He could not have saved the miners. The economic forces arrayed against them were beyond the power of any king to reverse. But he had tried to ensure that they were treated with dignity and in the political climate of 1926 that counted for something. There is something worth noting about the pattern that emerges from these two crises, Ireland and the general strike. In both cases, George's instinct was the same: moderation, empathy, and a willingness to see the other side's perspective. He was not a radical. He was not a reformer. He was not trying to reshape British society. He was simply a man who believed that the king should represent all his people, not just the wealthy, the powerful, or the politically convenient. This was not a revolutionary idea. It was, in fact, an extremely conservative one, rooted in the old-fashioned notion of noblesse oblige that George had absorbed from his Victorian upbringing. But in the polarised, volatile atmosphere of the 1920s, even this modest position placed him slightly at odds with the political establishment, and it earned him a level of public affection that politicians of the era struggled to match. While George was quietly mediating between factions and urging moderation on reluctant prime ministers, technology was creating a new opportunity and a new challenge for the monarchy. Radio had arrived. The British Broadcasting Company, later the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, had been established in 1922, and by the late 1920s it was rapidly becoming the most powerful communication medium in the country. For the first time in history, a single voice could reach millions of people simultaneously, in their own homes, without the intermediary of a newspaper or a public gathering. The potential implications for the monarchy were enormous. A king who could speak directly to his people, bypassing the press, bypassing parliament, bypassing every intermediary that had traditionally filtered the royal message. That was a fundamentally new kind of power, and nobody was entirely sure what to do with it. The idea of a royal Christmas broadcast had been floating around the BBC since the late 1920s, championed by the corporation's founding Director-General John Reith. Reith was a towering figure in British broadcasting. Literally, he stood 6'6", and he had a vision of the BBC as a moral and cultural institution that would unify the nation through shared experiences. He was also, it must be said, a man of considerable personal intensity, driven by a Presbyterian work ethic and a conviction that broadcasting should elevate rather than merely entertain. His relationship with the microphone was almost missionary. He believed that radio could make people better, smarter, and more connected to their fellow citizens, and he pursued this belief with a zeal that his staff found alternately inspiring and exhausting. A royal Christmas message broadcast across the Empire on Christmas Day was perfectly aligned with this vision. It would connect the king to his subjects in every corner of the globe. It would reinforce the sense of imperial unity at a time when that unity was beginning to fray, and it would establish the BBC as the platform through which the nation's most important messages were delivered. Reith lobbied persistently for the broadcast, cultivating relationships with the royal household, presenting technical proposals, and gradually wearing down the institutional resistance that greeted most new ideas in palace circles, where the attitude toward innovation generally ranged from cautious skepticism to outright horror. The technical challenges were not trivial. Broadcasting a live radio signal from Sandringham to every corner of the British Empire required a relay system of considerable complexity. The signal had to be transmitted from Sandringham to London, then distributed via shortwave transmitters to receiving stations in Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, and elsewhere, where it would be rebroadcast on local frequencies. The whole system depended on equipment that was, by modern standards, held together with optimism and solder. Engineers tested and retested the connections. Backup systems were prepared. The BBC's technical staff approached Christmas Day 1932 with the kind of nervous energy usually associated with a space launch, aware that the entire world was watching, or rather listening, and that failure would be both public and embarrassing. George was initially not enthusiastic. This should come as no surprise. George was not enthusiastic about most things that involved public speaking, new technology, or drawing attention to himself. He was comfortable with the traditional tools of monarchy: ceremonies, processions, carefully managed public appearances. The idea of sitting in front of a microphone and speaking to millions of invisible listeners was, for a man of his temperament, roughly equivalent to being asked to perform a stand-up comedy routine at the Royal Albert Hall. He did not want to do it. But his advisers, particularly Reith and Stamfordham's successor as private secretary, convinced him that the opportunity was too significant to pass up. The empire was changing. The old bonds of loyalty that had been reinforced through physical presence, the durbars, the tours, the ceremonial visits, were no longer sufficient in an era of mass communication. If the monarchy did not embrace radio, it would be left behind by politicians and other public figures who were already discovering the medium's power. And so, with characteristic reluctance and characteristic sense of duty, George agreed. The first Royal Christmas broadcast was delivered on December 25, 1932, at 3:15 in the afternoon, a time chosen because it was the optimal moment for reaching the maximum number of time zones across the Empire simultaneously, which meant that Australians were listening at midnight and Canadians were hearing it over breakfast, but the majority of the Empire could tune in at a reasonably civilised hour. George sat at a desk beneath the stairs in a small room at Sandringham House, a space chosen for its acoustics rather than its grandeur, which suited George perfectly. The script had been written by Rudyard Kipling, the Nobel Prize-winning author whose prose style combined imperial grandeur with accessible warmth in a way that was ideally suited to the occasion. The message was brief, just a few minutes long, and its language was simple, direct, and consciously inclusive. George spoke of the widespread spirit of goodwill across the empire and expressed his personal wish that the broadcast might bring the royal family closer to the people. The broadcast was heard by an estimated 20 million people across the British Empire, in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, in India, in South Africa, in the Caribbean, and in dozens of other territories scattered across the globe. For many of these listeners, it was the first time they'd ever heard the King's voice. Families gathered around their wireless sets. Radio was still new enough that listening was a communal activity, not the background noise it would later become. People sat in their parlours, in their kitchens, on farms and in villages thousands of miles from London, and they heard George speak. The technology was imperfect. There was static, there were signal fluctuations, and the sound quality was roughly equivalent to listening to someone talk through a particularly thick wall. But the simple fact of hearing the King, actually hearing him, in your own living room, through your own radio set, created a sense of connection and intimacy that no previous form of royal communication had achieved. The response was overwhelming. The BBC received thousands of letters from listeners who described the experience of hearing the King's voice as deeply moving. Some wrote about feeling, for the first time, a personal connection to the monarch. Others described how the broadcast had brought together families, communities, and in some cases entire villages around a shared moment of national belonging. Newspapers that had been sceptical about the idea reported on the broadcast with genuine enthusiasm. Even George himself, who had approached the microphone with all the enthusiasm of a man approaching a dentist's chair, admitted afterward that the experience had been less terrible than he had anticipated, which by George's standards was practically a rave review. The Christmas broadcast was, more than any treaty or proclamation, the moment when George's monarchy truly became modern. Previous monarchs had been seen, in processions, at ceremonies, in photographs and newsreels. George was the first to be heard, and the act of hearing someone speak, of absorbing their voice with its particular rhythms and inflections and pauses, creates a fundamentally different kind of relationship than the act of seeing them from a distance or reading about them in a newspaper. Radio made the King personal. It turned him from a remote symbol into a familiar presence, someone whose voice you recognised the way you recognised the voices of family members or neighbours. George delivered the Christmas broadcast every year from 1932 until 1935, and each year the audience grew larger. The tradition he established would be continued by every British monarch after him. His son George VI turned it into one of the defining rituals of the wartime years, and Elizabeth II maintained it for 7 decades, eventually transitioning from radio to television. The Christmas broadcast became one of the most enduring traditions of the modern British monarchy, a fixed point in the national calendar that survived wars, social revolutions, technological transformations, and the general erosion of deference that characterised the 20th century. And it all started with a reluctant king sitting under a staircase in Norfolk, reading words written by a Nobel laureate into a microphone he would rather not have been anywhere near. The other passion that defined George's later years was considerably quieter than radio, though no less revealing of his character. George was, as we touched upon earlier, an obsessive stamp collector. This might sound like the most boring hobby a king could possibly have, and in fairness, stamp collecting does not generally feature on lists of glamorous pastimes, but George's approach to philately was anything but casual. He amassed one of the finest stamp collections in the world, a collection so comprehensive, so meticulously organised, and so strategically acquired that it became, by the time of his passing, one of the most valuable private collections on the planet. He spent hours, genuine hours, regularly throughout his adult life, working on his collection. He had a dedicated room for it. He employed expert advisors. He attended auctions, sometimes anonymously, to acquire rare specimens. He corresponded with dealers and fellow collectors around the world. He once paid £1,400 for a single Mauritian stamp, a sum that, in the currency of the 1920s, was roughly equivalent to the annual salary of a senior professional. When a courtier reportedly asked whether some fool had paid that extraordinary sum for a stamp, George replied calmly that he was that fool. It was also, one suspects, a refuge. Being king was exhausting. The endless public appearances, the political crises, the family problems, the relentless weight of duty that never let up for a single day. Stamps were simple. Stamps were orderly. Stamps did not argue, did not cause constitutional crises, and did not threaten to abdicate. They sat in their albums properly classified and beautifully mounted, and they demanded nothing from their owner except careful handling and adequate storage. For a man whose life was defined by obligations to others, The stamp room at Buckingham Palace must have been one of the few places where George could be entirely himself, quiet, meticulous, absorbed in something he had chosen rather than something that had been imposed upon him. By the early 1930s, George had established a rhythm that seemed sustainable. He had navigated the crises of the previous decade. He had embraced radio. He had continued his stamp collection. He had maintained his partnership with Mary. His health was declining. The pelvis injury from 1915 continued to cause problems, and a severe bout of septicemia in 1928 had nearly ended his life and left him permanently weakened. The septicemia crisis had been genuinely terrifying. George developed an abscess on his chest that became infected, and within days he was fighting for his life. The infection spread, his temperature soared, and for several weeks the outcome was uncertain. Bulletins were posted outside Buckingham Palace, a tradition for reporting on royal health that dated back to the Victorian era, and the nation followed the king's condition with anxious attention. At one point, George's doctors performed an emergency operation to drain the abscess, and the procedure was so risky that the Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned to the palace in case last rites were needed. George survived, but the recovery was long, painful, and incomplete. He was sent to convalesce at Bognor Regis on the Sussex coast, where the sea air was supposed to speed his recovery. When his advisers later suggested he might return to Bognor for his health, George reportedly responded with words to the effect that he would rather do something anatomically improbable to Bognor, a remark that has been polished by history into various more and less printable forms, but that gives a useful insight into the king's state of mind during his final years. He was tired, he was in pain, and his patience for well-meaning suggestions was running thin. But he was still functioning, still fulfilling his duties, still showing up. The monarchy he had inherited in 1910 as a relatively traditional European institution had been transformed, through war, revolution, and his own quiet persistence, into something recognisably modern. A constitutional monarchy that derived its authority from public service rather than divine right, that communicated directly with its people through mass media, and that positioned itself as a symbol of national unity rather than aristocratic privilege. George had done all of this not through grand vision or dramatic leadership, but through the steady application of common sense, personal integrity, and an instinctive understanding of what the British people needed from their king. He was not brilliant. He was not charismatic. He was not particularly articulate in person, though his letters remained warm and his radio broadcasts were effective. He was simply, persistently, stubbornly good at a job he had never wanted, and had been given no choice about accepting. And in the process, he had quietly become one of the most consequential monarchs in British history, the man who built the foundation that the House of Windsor would stand on for the next century. But as the 1930s progressed, a shadow was gathering over everything George had built, and it was not coming from outside the palace walls. It was already inside them, living under the same roof, bearing the same name, and preparing to undo everything his father had spent a lifetime constructing. While George retreated to his stamp albums for solace, Mary had her own obsession, one that was considerably more visible, considerably more expensive, and considerably more controversial. Mary was a collector. Not a casual collector, not a hobbyist who picked up the occasional interesting piece at an antique market. Mary was a collector in the way that some people are athletes or musicians, with total dedication, formidable expertise, and an intensity that could be either deeply impressive or mildly alarming, depending on where you were standing and whether you happened to own something she wanted. Her passion for beautiful objects had roots in those formative years in Florence, where she'd spent her adolescence surrounded by Renaissance art, and developed an eye for quality that would serve her and occasionally unsettle those around her for the rest of her life. But what had started as a young woman's appreciation for aesthetics had evolved, by the time Mary was queen, into something much larger and more systematic. She was not simply admiring beautiful things, she was acquiring them, methodically, strategically, and on a scale that transformed the royal collection from a respectable accumulation of inherited treasures into one of the most significant private art holdings on the planet. The royal collection was already substantial when Mary began her work. Centuries of monarchs had accumulated paintings, sculptures, furniture, jewellery, porcelain, and decorative objects that filled the staterooms and private apartments of every royal residence. But much of the collection was disorganised, poorly catalogued, and scattered across multiple locations with little coherent curatorial vision. Mary brought to this situation the same organisational energy she had brought to the Needlework Guild and her wartime hospital visits. She catalogued, she reorganised, she researched provenance, she identified gaps in the collection, and set about filling them with the systematic determination of someone completing a particularly complex jigsaw puzzle. Her taste was eclectic, ranging across centuries and styles, with the appetite of someone who saw no reason to limit herself to a single area when the entire history of human craftsmanship was available. She collected jade figurines, small, intricately carved pieces from China and the Far East that she displayed in specially designed cabinets, arranged by period and origin with the precision of a museum curator. Jade, for Mary, was not just a decorative material. It was a substance with weight, history, and a kind of tactile beauty that satisfied something deep in her collector's instinct. She would hold pieces in her hands, feel their coolness, examine the translucency of the stone against the light. Her jade collection eventually numbered in the hundreds of pieces and was acknowledged by experts as one of the finest in private ownership anywhere in the world. She acquired Fabergé eggs, those extraordinary jewelled creations that the Russian imperial family had commissioned from the House of Fabergé, and that had become available on the international market after the Russian Revolution scattered the Romanov treasures across the world. The dispersal of the Romanov collection was, from a purely acquisitive standpoint, one of the great buying opportunities of the century. Masterpieces of jewelled craftsmanship that had been created for tsars and tsarinas were suddenly appearing in auction houses and dealers' catalogues at prices that, while still substantial, were a fraction of what they would have commanded before the Revolution. Mary, with her sharp eye and her willingness to spend, was well positioned to take advantage of this. She acquired several major Fabergé pieces, including eggs, boxes, and ornamental figures that became centerpieces of the Royal Collection's Russian decorative arts holdings. She bought portrait miniatures, those tiny, exquisitely painted portraits on ivory or vellum that had been the Instagram of the 18th century. The way people carried images of their loved ones before photography made the whole process considerably less expensive and considerably less artistic. She collected snuff boxes in gold, enamel, and precious stones. She acquired antique fans, textiles, and pieces of furniture that she placed in royal residences with an attention to historical accuracy that would have pleased a professional interior designer. She was particularly drawn to objects with royal provenance, pieces that had belonged to previous monarchs or that had some connection to the history of the British Crown. Reuniting these objects with the royal collection gave her a satisfaction that went beyond mere acquisition. It was, in her mind, a form of restoration, putting things back where they belonged. The scale of her collecting was impressive by any standard. Over the course of her lifetime, Mary added thousands of pieces to the royal collection, significantly expanding its range and depth. She purchased from dealers, from auction houses, and from private sellers. She accepted gifts. Royal families receive a great many gifts, and Mary was not one to turn them down. She commissioned new works from contemporary craftspeople, and she spent considerable time and energy tracking down objects that had been dispersed from royal ownership over the years, often negotiating their return through a combination of diplomatic charm and royal authority. Critics, however, noted that Mary's collecting had certain tendencies that were not entirely flattering. Her appetite for acquisition sometimes outpaced her discrimination. She could be drawn to objects for their associations rather than their intrinsic quality. A mediocre painting of a royal ancestor might catch her interest more readily than a masterpiece by an unknown artist. Some art historians have suggested that she prioritized comprehensiveness over connoisseurship, filling every available surface with objects rather than selecting fewer, finer pieces. Her private apartments were famously crowded, every table, shelf, and cabinet packed with figurines, boxes, frames, and ornaments in a density that crossed the line from curated display into something more closely resembling organized hoarding. Visitors described rooms where you could barely move without risking a collision with a jade elephant or a porcelain shepherdess. But it was a different aspect of Mary's collecting that generated the most persistent gossip, the most uncomfortable anecdotes, and the most enduring damage to her reputation. Mary had a habit, well documented by multiple independent sources, of admiring objects in other people's homes with such intensity and persistence that the owners felt compelled to offer them as gifts. The technique, if technique is the right word, was apparently quite consistent. Mary would visit an aristocratic house, notice a particular item, a vase, a figurine, a piece of silverware, and express her admiration for it in terms that made clear she was not simply making polite conversation. She would return to the object repeatedly during the visit. She would comment on it to other guests. She would hold it, examine it, and remark on how wonderfully it would complement a particular room at the palace. The message was impossible to miss. The Queen wanted this object, and it would be socially advantageous, or at the very least, socially prudent, to let her have it. The aristocratic families who experienced this phenomenon responded in various ways. Some gave in immediately and presented the admired object to Mary with gracious words about how honoured they were that Her Majesty appreciated their humble possession. Others tried more creative approaches. There are well-attested stories of host families being warned in advance that the Queen was coming, and hurriedly removing their most prized possessions from display, hiding valuable figurines in cupboards, locking away jewellery boxes and replacing genuinely fine pieces with less significant items that they could afford to lose. One oft-repeated anecdote describes a hostess who, upon learning that Mary had expressed interest in a particular set of antique chairs, had the chairs moved to an upstairs room and the door locked before the Queen could return for a second look. Whether this specific story is true is less important than the fact that it was widely believed and widely repeated, which tells you something about Mary's reputation in aristocratic circles. Was Mary a kleptomaniac? The word has been used, though it is probably inaccurate in the clinical sense. Kleptomania is a recognized psychological condition, characterized by an irresistible urge to steal objects that the person does not need and could easily afford. Mary did not steal in any conventional sense. She did not slip objects into her handbag when nobody was looking. What she did was use the enormous social pressure inherent in her position to acquire things that their owners might not have freely chosen to part with. This is a different thing from theft, but it is also a different thing from normal gift-giving. It occupied a grey area that was uniquely available to someone of Mary's rank, a space where the power dynamics between a queen and her subjects made it virtually impossible for the subject to say no, even if they desperately wanted to. The charitable interpretation is that Mary genuinely did not understand the pressure she was exerting. She had grown up in a world where gifts flowed naturally between royal families and their supporters, where the line between admiration and acquisition was blurred by centuries of precedent, and where the idea that a subject might resent giving something to the Queen was almost unthinkable. In Mary's mental framework, she was expressing appreciation for beautiful objects, and the owners were responding with appropriate generosity. The possibility that they were responding with reluctant compliance rather than genuine enthusiasm may simply not have occurred to her, or if it did, she may have dismissed it as irrelevant. The less charitable interpretation is that Mary knew exactly what she was doing and did not care. She wanted things, she had the power to get them, and the social conventions of her era gave her a mechanism for acquiring other people's possessions without technically doing anything wrong. The fact that her hosts were put in an impossible position, unable to refuse the Queen but unwilling to part with their property, was, in this reading, something Mary understood perfectly well and chose to exploit. The truth, as is usually the case with complicated people, probably lies somewhere in between. Mary was passionate about collecting. She was surrounded by beautiful objects from birth and developed a relationship with material culture that went beyond normal appreciation into something closer to need. She lived in a world where her desires were treated as commands, whether she framed them that way or not, and the feedback mechanisms that might have corrected her behaviour in a normal social context simply did not exist. Nobody tells a queen that she is being pushy. Nobody tells a queen that her admiration feels like a demand. The social structures that surrounded Mary were designed to accommodate her wishes, not to challenge them, and in that environment, a collecting instinct that might have remained within normal bounds in a private citizen grew into something that made aristocratic families nervous about inviting her for tea. There is also a psychological dimension worth considering. Mary had spent her childhood in financial instability, watching her mother spend recklessly while creditors circled. That experience of precariousness, of beautiful things being desired but unaffordable, of status being maintained through appearance rather than substance, may have left a deep imprint. For Mary, acquiring beautiful objects was not just about aesthetics or even about the royal collection. It may have been about security, about surrounding herself with tangible, permanent, beautiful things that could not be taken away the way her childhood security had been taken away by her parents' financial mismanagement. This does not excuse the behaviour, but it helps explain it in terms that go beyond simple greed or entitlement. Whatever the motivation, the consequence was a royal collection that was significantly richer and more comprehensive than it had been before Mary's involvement. Her additions were not always the finest individual pieces. She was better at quantity than quality, as her critics noted. But the cumulative effect was to create a collection of remarkable breadth and historical significance. The jade collection alone was among the finest in private hands. The Fabergé pieces were world-class. The portrait miniatures filled gaps that had existed for generations. Mary's collecting may have been aggressive, but it was not random. There was a curatorial intelligence behind it that deserved more credit than the kleptomania stories usually allowed. Mary continued collecting until the end of her life, undeterred by gossip, criticism, or the occasional locked door. It was, along with her dedication to public service, the defining passion of her existence, the thing that gave her the most consistent pleasure in a life that was otherwise largely defined by duty, restraint, and the suppression of personal desire. If she occasionally crossed a line in pursuit of that passion, she was at least crossing it in service of something larger than herself. The royal collection that exists today, the largest private art collection in the world, held in trust by the sovereign for the nation, owes a significant debt to the determined, discerning, slightly pushy queen who spent decades filling its shelves with jade, jewels, and the occasional reluctantly surrendered vase. As Mary was filling display cases at Buckingham Palace, a different kind of crisis was developing within the family, one that no amount of jade figurines or Fabergé eggs could fix. The problem had a name, and that name was David. Edward, Prince of Wales, David to his family, had grown from the anxious, scrutinised child of York Cottage into a young man of considerable charm, striking good looks, and almost no apparent interest in the responsibilities that came with being heir to the British throne. During the 1920s, he had become something of a global celebrity, perhaps the first member of the British royal family to achieve genuine international fame based on personal charisma rather than institutional position. He was handsome, fashionable, and photogenic in an era when mass media was creating a new kind of public figure. He wore his suits with a casual elegance that fashion magazines analysed in detail. He danced in nightclubs, he flew airplanes, he played polo with reckless enthusiasm. He cultivated an image of modernity and accessibility that was the precise opposite of his father's stiff, formal, duty-first approach to public life. His tours of the empire during the 1920s generated the kind of public excitement that modern celebrities would recognise immediately. In Canada, women lined the streets to catch a glimpse of him. In Australia, crowds broke through police barriers to get closer. In South Africa, he was treated like a visiting film star. The press called him the most eligible bachelor in the world, and for once the press was not exaggerating. As heir to the largest empire on earth, with personal charm, royal blood, and excellent cheekbones, David was quite literally the most sought-after unmarried man alive. He was mobbed by adoring crowds wherever he went, and the press could not get enough of him. George watched his son's celebrity with a mixture of pride, bewilderment, and growing unease. He was proud that David could connect with the public in a way that he himself had never managed. George knew his own limitations as a public figure, and he could see that David had gifts he lacked, but he was bewildered by the lifestyle that accompanied the celebrity. The nightclubs, the parties, the fashionable friends, the general atmosphere of pleasure-seeking that seemed to define David's private life. And he was uneasy because, beneath the glamour and the press coverage, he could see that David was avoiding the one thing that the heir to the throne absolutely had to do: settle down. Marriage, for a Prince of Wales, was not optional. It was a constitutional duty, arguably the single most important duty the heir had, after staying alive and staying out of prison. The heir needed a wife, specifically a suitable wife from an appropriate background, who could produce the next generation of heirs and serve as a credible future queen consort. The criteria were strict. She should be of noble birth, preferably from a European royal house. She should be Protestant. She should be unmarried and of unblemished reputation. She should be young enough to bear children, and she should be willing to accept a life of public service, ceremonial obligation, and relentless scrutiny that would make most rational people run in the opposite direction. David showed no interest whatsoever in fulfilling this duty. He had relationships, several of them, with various women, but they were invariably with women who were, by the rigid standards of royal suitability, completely inappropriate. They were married, or divorced, or American, or some combination of all three. His most significant pre-Wallace relationship had been with Frieda Dudley Ward, a married woman with whom he conducted a long-running affair that was well known in society circles, but kept out of the press by the same gentleman's agreement that would later protect the Wallace-Simpson story for so long. David seemed to be drawn specifically to women whom he could not possibly marry, which was either spectacularly bad luck or a subconscious strategy for avoiding the commitment that marriage would require. A psychiatrist might have had interesting things to say about this pattern. George, who was not a psychiatrist, simply found it infuriating. George confronted David about this repeatedly, with predictably poor results. The conversations between father and son, or rather, the arguments, because conversations implies a level of mutual understanding that was rarely achieved, followed a consistent pattern. George would lecture. David would listen with barely concealed impatience. George would demand that David take his responsibilities seriously. David would make vague promises that he had no intention of keeping. George would grow frustrated and raise his voice. David would retreat into sullen compliance that lasted precisely until he left the room. The relationship between them, never warm, deteriorated steadily through the late 1920s and early 1930s until it became something closer to mutual incomprehension than familial tension. Mary's role in this developing crisis was, characteristically, one of painful inaction. She could see the problem as clearly as George could, perhaps more clearly, since she was less emotionally entangled in it, and had, through her years of collecting and social observation, a keener sense of how other people perceived things. She knew that David's lifestyle was unsustainable, and that his refusal to marry suitably was creating a constitutional vulnerability that could damage the monarchy. She had seen Wallace-Simpson at social events and formed her own assessment, cold, calculating, and entirely wrong for the role she seemed to be angling toward. Mary was not a woman who formed hasty judgments, but when she formed them, they tended to be both precise and immovable. But she could not bring herself to confront her son directly. The same emotional reserve that had defined her marriage to George, the inability to speak openly about feelings, the deep discomfort with emotional directness, made it impossible for her to sit David down and tell him plainly what he needed to hear. She was, in a painful irony, repeating with her children the same communicative failure that had characterized her marriage. She could write beautifully about her concerns. She could express them to trusted confidants. She could signal them through the elaborate indirect channels that the royal household used for sensitive communications. But she could not look her son in the eye and say, "You are making a catastrophic mistake, and if you do not stop, you will destroy everything your father built," she wrote to him. She dropped hints. She expressed concern through intermediaries, but she never had the frank, forceful mother-to-son conversation that the situation demanded. And David, who had spent his entire life interpreting his mother's silence as indifference rather than reserve, did not receive the messages she was trying to send. This failure of communication, this inability of parents who loved their children to actually talk to them about the things that mattered, was, as we have seen, a defining feature of the George and Mary partnership. It had shaped all their children's lives, and in David's case, it would shape the future of the monarchy itself. And then Wallace-Simpson entered the picture. Wallace Warfield Simpson was an American socialite from Baltimore, born in 1896 into a family that was respectable but not wealthy, a background that, in the rigid social hierarchy of the British establishment, placed her roughly on a par with minor provincial gentry, which is to say several thousand rungs below the level required for a potential queen. She had married her first husband, a naval aviator named Earl Winfield Spencer, in 1916. The marriage was unhappy. Spencer had problems with alcohol that made domestic life difficult, and they divorced in 1927. She married her second husband, Ernest Simpson, a British-American businessman, in 1928. It was through the Simpsons' social circle in London that Wallace met David in 1931, at a house party that neither of them could have known would alter the course of British constitutional history. Wallace was intelligent, sharp-witted, stylish, and possessed of a forceful personality that David found irresistible. She was not conventionally beautiful. Photographs from the period show a slim, angular woman with strong features and immaculate grooming rather than the kind of soft prettiness that the era generally favoured. But she had something that apparently mattered more to David than conventional beauty. She treated him as a person rather than as a prince. She was direct with him. She challenged him. She did not defer to him the way everyone else in his life had been trained to defer. For a man who had spent his entire existence surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said, the experience of being contradicted by a confident American woman was apparently intoxicating. She was also, by every standard that the British establishment used to evaluate potential royal partners, spectacularly unsuitable. She was American. She was divorced. She was not aristocratic. She was not young enough to comfortably produce heirs. She was approaching 40 by the time the relationship became serious. And she was, to put it plainly, not the kind of woman that the British monarchy had any framework for accommodating. The Church of England, of which the king was the nominal head, did not recognise divorce. A king could not marry a divorced woman without creating a constitutional crisis that would pit the crown against the church, the government, and a significant portion of public opinion. David did not care. He was by all available evidence completely and overwhelmingly in love, or at least in the grip of an attachment so powerful that it overrode every other consideration, including the one consideration that should have been paramount: the survival of the institution he was born to lead. George became aware of the relationship gradually, through the kind of whispered reports and carefully worded briefings that palace staff used to convey information that nobody wanted to state directly. The British press, bound by a gentleman's agreement not to report on the private lives of the royal family, an arrangement that seems almost quaint by modern standards, maintained a tactful silence on the subject. But the American and European press had no such inhibitions, and stories about the Prince of Wales and his American companion were circulating freely in newspapers that any determined reader could access. George read these reports with the kind of grim attention that a ship's captain gives to a weather report predicting a hurricane. His reaction was a mixture of fury and despair. He had spent his entire life building and maintaining the reputation of the monarchy. He had navigated a world war, renamed his dynasty, mediated between warring factions in Ireland, and held the institution together through strikes, economic crises, and revolutionary upheavals across Europe. He had done all of this through patience, duty, self-sacrifice, and the suppression of his own desires in service of the crown. And now his own son, the heir he had spent 30 years preparing for the throne, was threatening to throw it all away for a woman who could not, by any reasonable interpretation of the rules, become queen. The irony was bitter enough to taste. George had given up his own romantic attachment to Julie Stoner 40 years earlier because duty required it. David was unwilling to make the same sacrifice, and the difference between father and son had never been more painfully clear. The conversations between George and David about Wallis Simpson were, by all accounts, brutal. George did not mince words. He told David that the relationship was unacceptable. He warned him that pursuing it would lead to disaster. He made clear that the monarchy could not survive the scandal of a king married to a twice-divorced American. David, with the stubbornness that was the one trait he had undeniably inherited from his father, refused to listen. As George's health continued to decline through 1935, his anxiety about David intensified. He was dying, slowly, painfully, and with the clear-eyed awareness that the man who would succeed him was not ready for the responsibility and might never be. His body, weakened by the pelvis injury, the septicemia, decades of smoking, and the accumulated toll of a lifetime of relentless duty, was failing. His lungs were giving out. His energy was diminishing. He still appeared at public functions when he could, still delivered his Christmas broadcast, still read his government papers with the conscientiousness that had defined his entire reign. But everyone around him could see that the end was approaching, and George himself was under no illusions. In his final months, George reportedly made several statements about David that reflected both his despair as a father and his insight as a king. The most famous of these, after my passing, "That boy will ruin himself within 12 months," has been recorded by multiple sources in slightly different forms, but its substance is consistent. It was a statement of remarkable prescience, born not from supernatural foresight, but from a father's intimate knowledge of his son's character and a king's clear understanding of the institutional demands that David was manifestly unprepared to meet. George knew David. He knew his weaknesses, his selfishness, his inability to subordinate personal desire to public duty. And he knew Wallis Simpson, or rather, he knew enough about her to understand that David's attachment to her was not a passing infatuation, but something more dangerous, something that would not simply burn out and resolve itself. There was also a quieter prediction, reported by some sources, in which George expressed his hope that David would never marry, and that nothing would come between the crown and his second son Albert and Albert's daughter Elizabeth. Whether George actually said these words or whether they were attributed to him after the fact by people who wanted to burnish his reputation for foresight, they captured something true about his state of mind. George, dying, looked past his eldest son to the next generation and saw in his granddaughter Elizabeth the qualities, duty, discipline, steadiness, that David so conspicuously lacked. It was, if true, the final act of a king whose instincts about people had rarely been wrong, even when his ability to communicate with them had been persistently inadequate. The prediction would prove almost exactly correct. George passed away on January 20th, 1936. David became King Edward VIII, and within 11 months the abdication crisis that George had feared would engulf the monarchy in the most dangerous constitutional emergency since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But the story of that crisis, and of how the silent partnership of George and Mary ultimately saved the crown even after George was gone, belongs to the next chapter. On the evening of January 20th, 1936 at Sandringham House, something happened that would not become public knowledge for over 50 years, and when it did, it would raise questions about the boundary between mercy and something considerably darker. George V was dying. This had been apparent for weeks. His lungs, ravaged by decades of heavy smoking and weakened by the septicemia that had nearly taken him in 1928, were failing. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, barely able to speak and clearly suffering. The family had gathered at Sandringham, Mary, the children, the household staff, in the sombre vigil that accompanies the final hours of any life, but that takes on an additional dimension of ceremony and constitutional significance when the life in question belongs to a reigning monarch. What happened next was recorded in the private diary of Lord Dawson of Penn, the royal physician who had been attending George throughout his final illness. Dawson's diary, which was not made public until 1986, reveals that the king's passing was not entirely natural. At approximately 11 o'clock that evening, Dawson administered injections of morphine and cocaine into George's distended jugular vein. The injections were intended to hasten the end, to ensure that the king passed peacefully and crucially in time for the announcement to appear in the morning edition of the Times, rather than in the less dignified evening papers. Dawson had apparently decided that the king's dignity required him to expire on a schedule compatible with the news cycle of a respectable broadsheet. The ethical implications of this decision are, to put it mildly, complicated. Dawson acted without the explicit consent of the family. Mary and the children were not consulted about the injections, and there is no evidence that George himself, who was barely conscious, was asked whether he wished to have his departure accelerated. Dawson appears to have made the decision unilaterally, based on his own medical judgment and his own sense of what was appropriate for a dying king. By modern medical ethics, this would constitute euthanasia, a practice that was illegal in Britain in 1936 and remains a subject of intense moral debate today. By the standards of the era, it occupied a grey area where the authority of a royal physician to manage his patient's final moments was broadly accepted, even if nobody talked about it too specifically. The family, gathered in the drawing room at Sandringham, was informed that the king had passed away at 11:55 p.m. The formal announcement was prepared for the morning papers. The Times would carry the news under a black-bordered headline, just as Dawson had intended. The BBC interrupted its scheduled programming to broadcast the news to a nation that, while expecting it, was nonetheless shaken by the reality. Across the country, people who had heard the king's voice on Christmas Day just 3 weeks earlier now learned that the voice had fallen silent. Flags were lowered to half-mast. Theatres closed. The ordinary business of national life paused in the way it does when a figure who has been a constant presence for a quarter of a century is suddenly gone. George V, King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, Emperor of India, the quiet stamp collector who had steered the monarchy through a world war, an Irish crisis, a general strike, and the invention of radio, was gone. He was 70 years old, and he had reigned for 25 years. His body lay in state at Westminster Hall, where hundreds of thousands of people filed past to pay their respects. The same public that he had addressed through their wireless sets, that he had visited in hospitals and factories, that he had served with the dogged persistence that was his defining characteristic. Mary's reaction, as recorded by those present, was controlled and dignified, which for Mary was both completely in character and almost certainly incomplete. She kissed her husband's hand. She stepped back. She allowed the constitutional machinery to begin its work, whatever she felt privately, and she had just lost the partner with whom she had shared 43 years of life. The man who could only tell her he loved her on paper, the man whose gruff, stubborn, emotionally inarticulate presence had been the fixed point of her entire adult existence. She kept it behind the composed facade that had been her public face for 4 decades, and then she did something that told you everything about Mary's understanding of duty. She took the hand of her eldest son David, now, as of that moment, King Edward VIII, and she kissed it. The gesture was ancient and deliberate. It was the act of a subject acknowledging her sovereign. Mary, the Dowager Queen, was subordinating herself to the new king, performing the ritual of succession with the same precision she brought to everything. The crown had passed. The institution continued. Personal grief would have to wait. David's reaction to his father's passing was, by several accounts, more dramatic and less controlled. He wept openly. He was visibly distressed. Some observers interpreted this as genuine grief for a father with whom he had had a difficult but real relationship. Others, less charitably, noted that David's tears might have been partly for himself, for the life of freedom and pleasure that had just ended, replaced by a burden of responsibility that he had never wanted, and was spectacularly ill-equipped to bear. The reign of Edward VIII began on January 21st, 1936, and from its first moments it was clear that things were going to be different. David, now Edward, approached the job of king with the same casual modernising instinct that had made him popular as Prince of Wales, and that now, applied to the actual business of governance, began to alarm the establishment. He broke with protocol in ways that range from the trivial to the genuinely concerning. He walked through crowds in ways that his security team found reckless. He made offhand comments about government policy that made civil servants wince. He reviewed state papers with the attention span of someone who had better things to do, which in Edward's case usually meant dinner with Wallis Simpson. He interfered with the running of the royal household, making changes to staffing and procedure that alienated the experienced servants who had served his father for decades. He was, in the language of the civil service, difficult, which was the polite way of saying that he was a nightmare. He also had troubling political instincts. Edward expressed admiration for aspects of the Nazi regime in Germany that more astute observers found deeply alarming. He visited Germany, met with senior Nazi officials, and made comments about German efficiency and social organisation that were, at best, naive, and at worst, sympathetic to a regime that was already persecuting its own citizens. Whether Edward's views amounted to genuine fascist sympathies, or merely the thoughtless opinions of a man who did not understand the implications of what he was saying, remains debated by historians. But his comments were noted by the British intelligence services, by the Foreign Office, and by a political establishment that was growing increasingly concerned about the judgment of its new king. But the real problem, the problem that everybody in the inner circle knew about, and that the British public was still blissfully unaware of, was Wallis Simpson. The relationship had not ended with George's passing. If anything, it had intensified. Edward made clear to his closest advisers, within weeks of becoming king, that he intended to marry Wallis, who was still at that point married to Ernest Simpson, though divorce proceedings were being arranged. The advisers were horrified. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, was horrified. The Archbishop of Canterbury was horrified. The Dominion governments, when consulted, were horrified. Virtually everyone who understood the constitutional implications of a king marrying a twice-divorced American woman was, to use a technical term, absolutely horrified. The constitutional, political and public relations objections were exactly as severe as everyone had warned, and now they were no longer hypothetical. Edward's response was characteristically simple. He did not care. The crisis came to a head in December 1936. The British press, which had maintained its silence on the king's relationship with Wallis Simpson for years, while foreign newspapers covered it extensively, finally broke its self-imposed embargo in early December. The trigger was a sermon by the Bishop of Bradford, who made what was probably an innocent remark about the king needing divine grace for his duties, a comment that the press interpreted as permission to discuss what everyone in Fleet Street had known for months but nobody had printed. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The British public, which had been largely unaware of the full scope of the crisis, suddenly discovered that their king was planning to marry a twice-divorced American, and that the government, the church, and the Dominion nations were all opposed. The public reaction was not what Edward had hoped. He had apparently expected a wave of popular support, the romantic narrative of a king who loved so deeply that he would sacrifice everything for his beloved. Some people did sympathise, but the majority opinion, at least as expressed through letters, petitions, and the rapidly forming consensus in newspapers and public meetings, was that the king should do his duty or go. The working-class communities that Edward had visited as Prince of Wales, the factories and mining towns where he had shaken hands and expressed sympathy, largely sided with tradition. They had endured the war, the strikes, the depression. They had made sacrifices, and they expected their king to make sacrifices too. Baldwin told Edward plainly that he had three options: give up Wallis Simpson, marry her against the advice of the government and trigger a constitutional crisis, or abdicate. A fourth option, a morganatic marriage, in which Wallis would become Edward's wife but not queen, was proposed and rejected by both Baldwin's cabinet and the Dominion governments. Edward, after what appears to have been remarkably little deliberation for a decision of such magnitude, chose abdication. On December 10th, 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere, his country retreat in Surrey, witnessed by his three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. The scene was tense, emotional, and surreal. The man who had been groomed from birth to wear the crown was signing it away in a room that was, according to one account, still decorated for Christmas. On December, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they became, would spend the rest of their lives in a peculiar exile, wealthy, socially prominent, and permanently excluded from the family and the institution that Edward had abandoned. The abdication was unprecedented in modern British history. No king had voluntarily given up the throne since the murky circumstances of Edward II in 1327, and that had been less a voluntary abdication than a forcible removal accompanied by a hot poker, a comparison that, while historically interesting, is probably best not dwelt upon. Edward VIII's abdication was entirely voluntary, entirely conscious, and entirely the result of one man's decision that his personal happiness mattered more than his institutional duty. It was, depending on your perspective, either the greatest love story of the 20th century or the most spectacular dereliction of duty in the history of the British Crown. Mary's response to the abdication tells you everything about the woman and everything about the values she held. She was devastated, not romantically, not sentimentally, but constitutionally. To Mary, the crown was not a job that you could resign from when it became inconvenient. It was a sacred trust, a lifelong commitment, an obligation that transcended personal desire. The idea that her son would voluntarily abandon this trust for a woman, any woman, but especially this woman, was to Mary incomprehensible. She had spent her entire life suppressing her personal desires in service of the crown. George had done the same. They had both sacrificed their freedom, their privacy, and their emotional comfort for the institution. And now David was throwing all of that away because he wanted to marry someone who did not meet the requirements. Mary never forgave Edward for the abdication. She never accepted Wallis Simpson. She refused to receive her, refused to acknowledge her as a member of the family, and maintained this position with the immovable consistency that characterized everything she did. When Edward occasionally visited England in the years that followed, Mary would see him. He was after all still her son, but she would not see Wallis. The door of Marlborough House, where Mary lived after George's passing, was open to Edward but closed to the woman for whom he had given up the crown. This was not spite, it was principle. Mary believed that what Edward had done was wrong, not wrong in a personal sense, but wrong in a constitutional, moral and institutional sense, and she was not prepared to pretend otherwise, no matter how many years passed. But it was a statement that the abdication was an aberration, that the values of George V's reign would continue, and that the new king would follow in his father's footsteps rather than his brother's. Albert, now George VI, was terrified. He had spent his entire life preparing to be a supportive second son, not a king. His stammer, while significantly improved through years of therapy with the Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue, still made public speaking an ordeal that required immense courage and preparation every single time. His confidence, battered by a childhood of paternal criticism and overshadowed by his glamorous older brother, was fragile. He was, by his own assessment, completely unready for the role that had been thrust upon him. On the night of the abdication, He reportedly told his cousin Louis Mountbatten that he had never wanted this, that he was not equipped for it, and that he did not know how he would manage. It was the kind of raw honesty that the royal family rarely permitted itself, and it reflected the genuine terror of a man who had just been handed the most demanding job in the country by someone who had decided it was not worth keeping. His wife, the former Lady Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, was his greatest immediate source of strength. She had married Albert expecting to be a duchess, not a queen, and the abdication had thrust her into a role she had not anticipated, and had, by some accounts, actively dreaded. But she possessed qualities that would prove essential: warmth, composure, a natural gift for public engagement, and a steely determination beneath her charming exterior that would eventually earn her the nickname the most dangerous woman in Europe from Adolf Hitler himself, though that particular compliment lay a few years in the future. Mary stepped into the breach alongside her daughter-in-law. She supported her second son with the fierce, quiet determination that had characterized her support for George V. She advised him on matters of protocol and precedent, drawing on 40 years of experience at the centre of the monarchy. She reassured him that the qualities he possessed, steadiness, integrity, dedication, were exactly what the country needed after the chaos of the abdication. She helped Elizabeth navigate the sudden transition from Duchess to Queen Consort, sharing the institutional knowledge that only decades of service could provide. She was, in the most critical months of the new reign, the institutional memory of the monarchy, the living link between the stable world that George V had built and the uncertain future that George VI was now responsible for navigating. Her public appearances during this period were carefully calibrated to project stability and continuity. She attended George VI's coronation in May 1937 with the composed dignity that the nation had come to expect from her, though the occasion must have been bittersweet, watching her second son assume the crown that should have been her first son's in a ceremony that was taking place only because of a family catastrophe. She sat in the royal gallery at Westminster Abbey, upright, composed, and immaculate, giving nothing away. Whatever she felt, and the layers of emotion she must have been processing were almost unimaginable in their complexity, she kept it to herself. She was, as always, the dutiful queen. The nation needed reassurance, and she provided it. The year 1936 had given Britain 3 kings in 12 months: George V, Edward VIII, and George VI. It was a constitutional roller coaster that had no precedent in modern British history, and that shook public confidence in the monarchy more deeply than anything since the Cromwellian Revolution. And yet, the monarchy survived. It survived because the foundations that George and Mary had laid, the emphasis on duty, the commitment to public service, the willingness to subordinate personal desire to institutional need, proved strong enough to withstand even the shock of an abdication. George VI, for all his initial fear and uncertainty, would prove to be an excellent king, steady, courageous, and devoted to the same principles that his father had embodied. And Mary, the Dowager Queen, would live on as the guardian of those principles for another 17 years. Mary's final years were spent at Marlborough House in London, the grand residence on Pall Mall that had once belonged to George's parents, and that now served as the Dowager Queen's official home. She maintained a routine of public engagements, private collecting, and family management that would have exhausted a woman half her age. She attended functions with the punctuality and precision that had defined her entire public life. She visited exhibitions and galleries, her collector's eye still sharp, her opinions still firmly held. She corresponded with family members across Europe, maintaining the web of royal connections that had always been part of her world, even as that world contracted around her. She lived through the Second World War at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, where she was evacuated for safety, though she reportedly did not go willingly, as the idea of being sent to the countryside while London was being bombed struck her as contrary to the principle of sharing in national hardship that she had established during the previous war. At Badminton, she organised salvage drives, visited local communities, and applied the same energetic approach to wartime service that she had demonstrated 25 years earlier. She was in her 70s by this point, but age had diminished neither her determination nor her capacity for making people slightly nervous about the security of their antique collections. She watched her granddaughter Elizabeth grow from a child into a young woman, and then into the heir presumptive to the throne, and she saw in Elizabeth the same qualities that she and George had tried to instill in their own children: duty, discipline, composure, and an understanding that the crown was a service, not a privilege. Elizabeth, who adored her grandmother, absorbed these lessons with a thoroughness that would define her own 7-decade reign. The model of monarchy that Elizabeth II would carry into the 21st century, the emphasis on public service, the emotional restraint, the relentless commitment to showing up regardless of personal cost, was, in its essentials, the model that George and Mary had created during the tumultuous first half of the 20th century. Mary lived to see the passing of George VI in February 1952. Another loss, another king gone, another son buried before his mother. She was 84 years old and had now outlived her husband, 2 of her sons, and the era that had formed her. Elizabeth was now Queen, and the coronation was scheduled for June 1953. Mary expressed her firm wish that, should she not survive to see the ceremony, it should proceed without delay. The crown, as always, came before personal grief. She passed away on March 24, 1953, 10 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation. She was 85. The nation mourned a woman who had been a fixture of public life for over half a century, a presence so constant, so reliable, so immovably steady that many people could not remember a time when Queen Mary had not been part of the national landscape. She had been a princess, a duchess, a queen consort and a dowager queen. She had lived through 2 world wars, an abdication crisis, the dissolution of the British Empire, and the transformation of the monarchy from an imperial institution into a national one. She had collected jade, reorganised the royal collection, collaborated with trade unionists, survived the loss of a child, and navigated 4 decades of marriage to a man who could only say, "I love you" in writing. She had been accused of kleptomania, praised for her war work, criticised for her parenting, and admired for her steadfastness. She was, in short, one of the most complex, capable, and underestimated figures in the history of the British Crown. And now, as we reach the end of this story, it is worth stepping back to consider what George and Mary actually achieved, because the full scale of their accomplishment is easy to miss when you are focused on the individual crises, the personal dramas, and the everyday absurdities of royal life. When George and Mary married in 1893, the British monarchy was an imperial institution, powerful, remote, and sustained by a network of European royal connections that had operated more or less unchanged for centuries. By the time Mary passed away in 1953, the monarchy was something entirely different, a national institution, a symbol of public service, a living connection between the crown and the ordinary citizens of a democratic nation. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because George and Mary, through decades of quiet, persistent, emotionally inarticulate effort, built a new model of what monarchy could be. George contributed the foundation, the emphasis on duty, the willingness to adapt, the instinct for moderation, the embrace of new technology, the recognition that the crown served the people rather than the other way around. He was not a visionary. He was not a reformer. He was a stamp collector who happened to be king, and he approached the job with the same meticulous, patient attention to detail that he brought to his albums. He did not make grand gestures. He made steady, incremental decisions that, cumulatively, reshaped the institution from the inside. Mary contributed the human connection, the bridge between the palace and the people, the wartime service, the institutional knowledge, the cultural sophistication that kept the monarchy relevant in an era of rapid social change. She was the one who went to the hospitals, who organised the volunteers, who collaborated with trade unionists, who understood that the Queen's role was not decorative but functional. She was also the one who held the family together, imperfectly, with all the limitations of her emotional vocabulary, through crises that would have shattered less resilient partnerships. Together, they created a template that every subsequent British monarch has followed. The Christmas broadcast that George pioneered is still delivered every year. The model of public service that Mary established is still the standard by which royal women are judged. The emphasis on duty over pleasure, on stability over glamour, on showing up over standing out, all of these principles trace back directly to the partnership that was forged in a garden at Sheen Lodge in 1893, when a shy naval officer proposed to a woman he'd been assigned to marry. George V has been consistently underestimated by historians. He sits in the shadow of 2 towering figures, his grandmother Victoria, who gave her name to an era, and his granddaughter Elizabeth II, who gave her name to a lifetime. Between these two colossi, George appears small, quiet, and unremarkable. He left no great speeches, except the Belfast Address. He fought no wars personally, except the one fought by his generation. He introduced no dramatic reforms, except the complete reinvention of the monarchy's identity, purpose, and relationship with its people. Not bad for a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his stamps. Mary, similarly, has been reduced by popular memory to a stern-faced figure in a toque hat. The rigid, formal, emotionally distant grandmother who liked jade and frightened aristocrats into giving her their possessions. This caricature misses almost everything that mattered about her. The intellectual depth, the organisational brilliance, the wartime courage, the cultural vision, and the quiet, persistent strength that held the House of Windsor together through its most dangerous moments. The most remarkable thing about the marriage of George V and Queen Mary is how much it achieved despite how little it seemed to offer. It began not with love, but with a funeral. It was sustained not by passion, but by duty. It communicated not through spoken words, but through letters that were read in separate rooms. It produced not a harmonious family, but a collection of damaged individuals who would spend their lives dealing with the consequences of their parents' emotional limitations. And yet, from this seemingly unpromising foundation, George and Mary built the most successful royal partnership of the 20th century. A partnership that saved the British monarchy, defined its modern character, and created the template that still governs it today. There is a lesson in that, perhaps, for anyone who has ever been told that love is all you need. George and Mary did not have love. Not at the beginning, anyway. What they had was something arguably more durable: mutual respect, complementary skills, shared purpose, and an absolute, unshakable commitment to the institution they served. Over time, these things grew into something that looked very much like love. The kind of love that does not announce itself with fireworks and declarations, but that reveals itself through decades of quiet, imperfect, stubbornly faithful partnership. The most successful royal marriage of the 20th century started not with a proposal, but with a pivot. Not with a love letter, but with a letter of condolence, not with joy, but with duty. And it ended 60 years later, with a woman who had been told to marry a stranger having spent her entire life proving that sometimes the partnerships we do not choose are the ones that matter most. And on that note, from all of us here on this channel, good night, sleep well, and sweet dreams. We will see you on the next one.